Chapter 11, Part A of Roderick Hudson, by Henry James. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Mrs. Hudson. Of Roderick, meanwhile, Rowland saw nothing, but he immediately went to Mrs. Hudson and assured her that her son was in even exceptionally good health and spirits. After this he called again on the two ladies from Northampton, but as Roderick's absence continued he was able neither to furnish nor to obtain much comfort. Miss Garland's apprehensive face seemed to him an image of his own state of mind. He was profoundly depressed. He felt that there was a storm in the air, and he wished it would come, without more delay, and perform its ravages. On the afternoon of the third day he went into St. Peter's, his frequent resort whenever the outer world was disagreeable. From a heartache to a Roman rain, there were few importunate pains the great church did not help him to forget. He had wandered there for half an hour, when he came upon a short figure lurking in the shadow of one of the great piers. He saw it was that of an artist, hastily transferring to his sketch book a memento of some fleeting variation in the scenery of the basilica; and in a moment he perceived that the artist was little Sam Singleton. Singleton pocketed his sketch book with a guilty air, as if it cost his modesty a pang to be detected in this greedy culture of opportunity. Rowland always enjoyed meeting him. Talking with him in these days was as good as a wayside gush of clear cold water on a long hot walk. There was perhaps no drinking vessel, and you had to apply your lips to some simple natural conduit, but the result was always a sense of extreme moral refreshment. On this occasion he mentally blessed the ingenuous little artist, and heard presently with keen regret that he was to leave Rome on the morrow. Singleton had come to bid farewell to St. Peter's, and he was gathering a few supreme memories. He had earned a purse full of money, and he was meaning to take a summer's holiday, going to Switzerland, to Germany, to Paris. In the autumn he was to return home. His family, composed, as Rowland knew, of a father who was a cashier in a bank, and 5 unmarried sisters, one of whom gave lyceum lectures on women's rights, the whole resident in Buffalo, New York, had been writing him peremptory letters and appealing to him as a son, brother, and fellow citizen. He would have been grateful for another year in Rome, but what must be, must be, and he had laid up treasure which, in Buffalo, would seem infinite. They talked some time. Rowland hoped they might meet in Switzerland and take a walk or two together. Singleton seemed to feel that Buffalo had marked him for her own. He was afraid he should not see Rome again for many a year. "So you expect to live at Buffalo?" Rowland asked sympathetically. "Well, it will depend upon the views, upon the attitude of my family," Singleton replied. "Oh, I think I shall get on. I think it can be done. If I find it can be done, I shall really be quite proud of it. As an artist, of course, I mean, you know. Do you know I have some 900 sketches? I shall live in my portfolio. And so long as one is not in Rome, pray what does it matter where one is? But how I shall envy all you Romans, you and Mr. Gloriani, and Mr. Hudson especially." "Don't envy Hudson. He has nothing to envy." Singleton grinned at what he considered a harmless jest. "Yes, he's going to be the great man of our time. And I say, Mr. Mallet, isn't it a mighty comfort that it's we who have turned him out?" "Between ourselves," said Rowland, "he has disappointed me." Singleton stared, open-mouthed. "Dear me, what did you expect?" "Truly," said Rowland to himself, "what did I expect?" "I confess," cried Singleton, "I can't judge him rationally. He fascinates me. He's the sort of man one makes a hero of." "Strictly speaking, he is not a hero," said Rowland. Singleton looked intensely grave, and with almost tearful eyes. "Is there anything amiss, anything out of the way about him?" he timidly asked. Then, as Rowland hesitated to reply, he quickly added, "Please, if there is, don't tell me. I want to know no evil of him, and I think I should hardly believe it. In my memories of this Roman artist life he will be the central figure. He will stand there in radiant relief, as beautiful and unspotted as one of his own statues." "Amen," said Rowland gravely. He remembered afresh that the sea is inhabited by big fishes and little, and that the latter often find their way down the throats of the former. Singleton was going to spend the afternoon in taking last looks at certain other places, and Rowland offered to join him on his sentimental circuit. But as they were preparing to leave the church he heard himself suddenly addressed from behind. Turning, he beheld a young woman whom he immediately recognized as Madame Grandoni's maid. Her mistress was present, she said, and begged to confer with him before he departed. This summons obliged Rowland to separate from Singleton, to whom he bade farewell. He followed the messenger, and presently found Madame Grandoni occupying a liberal area on the steps of the tribune, behind the great altar, where, spreading a shawl on the polished red marble, she had comfortably seated herself. He expected that she had something especial to impart, and she lost no time in bringing forth her treasure. "Don't shout very loud," she said. "Remember that we are in church. There's a limit to the noise one may make even in St. Peter's. Christina Light was married this morning to Prince Casamassima." Rowland did not shout at all. He gave a deep short murmur. "Married this morning?" "Married this morning at 7 o'clock, le plus tranquillement du monde, before 3 or 4 persons. The young couple left Rome an hour afterwards." For some moments this seemed to him really terrible. The dark little drama of which he had caught a glimpse had played itself out. He had believed that Christina would resist. That she had succumbed was a proof that the pressure had been cruel. Rowland's imagination followed her forth with an irresistible tremor into the world toward which she was rolling away with her detested husband and her stifled ideal. But it must be confessed that if the first impulse of his compassion was for Christina, the second was for Prince Casamassima. Madame Grandoni acknowledged an extreme curiosity as to the secret springs of these strange doings. Casamassima's sudden dismissal, his still more sudden recall, the hurried private marriage. "Listen," said Rowland hereupon, "and I will tell you something." And he related in detail his last visit to Mrs. Light, and his talk with this lady, with Christina, and with the Cavaliere. "Good," she said. "It's all very curious, but it's a riddle, and I only half guessed it." "Well," said Rowland, "I desire to harm no one, but certain suppositions have taken shape in my mind which serve as a solvent to several ambiguities." "It is very true," Madame Grandoni answered, "that the Cavaliere, as he stands, has always needed to be explained. He is explained by the hypothesis that 23 years ago at Ancona, Mrs. Light had a lover." "I see. Ancona was dull, Mrs. Light was lively, and 23 years ago perhaps the Cavaliere was fascinating. Doubtless it would be fairer to say that he was fascinated. Poor Giacosa!" "He has had his compensation," Rowland said. "He has been passionately fond of Christina." "Naturally. But has Christina never wondered why?" If she had been near guessing, her mother's shabby treatment of him would have put her off the scent. Mrs. Light's conscience has apparently told her that she could expiate an hour's too great kindness by 20 years' contempt. So she kept her secret. But what is the profit of having a secret unless you can make some use of it? The day at last came when she could turn hers to account. She could let the skeleton out of the closet and create a panic. "I don't understand." "Neither do I, morally," said Rowland. "I only conceive that there was a horrible, fabulous scene. The poor Cavaliere stood outside at the door, white as a corpse and as dumb. The mother and daughter had it out together. Mrs. Light burned her ships. When she came out she had 3 lines of writing in her daughter's hand, which the Cavaliere was dispatched with to the prince. They overtook the young man in time, and when he reappeared he was delighted to dispense with further waiting. I don't know what he thought of the look in his bride's face, but that is how I roughly reconstruct history." "Christina was forced to decide, then, that she could not afford not to be a princess?" "She was reduced by humiliation. She was assured that it was not for her to make conditions, but to thank her stars that there were none made for her. If she persisted, she might find it coming to pass that there would be conditions, and the formal rupture, the rupture that the world would hear of and pry into, would then proceed from the prince and not from her." "That's all nonsense," said Madame Grandoni energetically. "To us, yes, but not to the proudest girl in the world. deeply wounded in her pride, and not stopping to calculate probabilities, but muffling her shame with an almost sensuous relief in a splendour that stood within her grasp and asked no questions. Is it not possible that the late Mr. Light had made an outbreak before witnesses who were still living? "Certainly her marriage now," said Madame Grandoni less analytically, "has the advantage that it takes her away from her parents." This lady's farther comments upon the event are not immediately pertinent to our history. There were some other comments of which Rowland had a deeply oppressive foreboding. He called on the evening of the morrow upon Mrs. Hudson, and found Roderick with the two ladies. Their companion had apparently but lately entered, and Rowland afterwards learned that it was his first appearance since the writing of the note which had so distressed his mother. He had flung himself upon a sofa, where he sat with his chin upon his breast, staring before him with a sinister spark in his eye. He fixed his gaze on Rowland, but gave him no greeting. He had evidently been saying something to startle the women. Mrs. Hudson had gone and seated herself, timidly and imploringly, on the edge of the sofa, trying to take his hand. Miss Garland was applying herself to some needlework with conscious intentness. Mrs. Hudson gave Rowland, on his entrance, a touching look of gratitude. "Oh, we have such blessed news," she said. "Roderick is ready to leave Rome." "It's not blessed news, it's most damnable news!" cried Roderick. "Oh, but we are very glad, my son, and I am sure you will be when you get away. You're looking most dreadfully thin, isn't he, Mr. Mallet? It's plain enough you need a change. I'm sure we will go wherever you like. Where would you like to go?" Roderick turned his head slowly and looked at her. He had let her take his hand, which she pressed tenderly between her own. He gazed at her for some time in silence. "Poor mother!" he said at last, in a portentous tone. "My own dear son!" murmured Mrs. Hudson, in all the innocence of her trust. "I don't care a straw where you go. I don't care a straw for anything." "Oh, my dear boy, you must not say that before all of us here, before Mary, before Mr. Mallet." "Mary? Mr. Mallet?" Roderick repeated almost savagely. He released himself from the clasp of his mother's hand, and turned away, leaning his elbows on his knees and holding his head in his hands. There was a silence. Rowland said nothing because he was watching Miss Garland. "Why should I stand on ceremony with Mary and Mr. Mallet?" Roderick presently added. "Mary pretends to believe I'm a fine fellow, and if she believes it as she ought to, nothing I can say will alter her opinion. Mallet knows I'm a hopeless humbug, so I needn't mince my words with him." "Ah, my dear, don't use such dreadful language," said Mrs. Hudson. "Aren't we all devoted to you and proud of you, and waiting only to hear what you want, so that we may do it?" Roderick got up and began to walk about the room. He was evidently in a restless, reckless, profoundly demoralized condition. Rowland felt that it was literally true that he did not care a straw for anything, but he observed with anxiety that Mrs. Hudson, who did not know on what delicate ground she was treading, was disposed to chide him caressingly as a mere expression of tenderness. He foresaw that she would bring down the hovering thunderbolt on her head. "In God's name," Roderick cried, "don't remind me of my obligations! It's intolerable to me, and I don't believe it's pleasant to Mallet. I know they're tremendous. I know I shall never repay them. I'm bankrupt. Do you know what that means?" The poor lady sat staring, dismayed, and Rowland angrily interfered. "Don't talk such stuff to your mother!" he cried. "Don't you see you're frightening her?" "Frightening her? She may as well be frightened first as last. Do I frighten you, mother?" Roderick demanded. "Oh, Roderick, what do you mean?" whimpered the poor lady. "Mr. Mallet, what does he mean?" "I mean that I'm an angry, savage, disappointed, miserable man," Roderick went on. "I mean that I can't do a stroke of work nor think a profitable thought. I mean that I'm in a state of helpless rage and grief and shame. Helpless, helpless, that's what it is. You can't help me, poor mother, not with kisses, nor tears, nor prayers. Mary can't help me, not for all the honor she does me, nor all the big books on art that she pores over. Mallet can't help me, not with all his money, nor all his good example, nor all his friendship, which I'm so profoundly well aware of. Not with it all multiplied 1,000 times and repeated to all eternity. I thought you would help me, you and Mary. That's why I sent for you. But you can't. Don't think it. The sooner you give up the idea, the better for you. Give up being proud of me, too. There's nothing left of me to be proud of. A year ago I was a mighty fine fellow. But do you know what has become of me now? I have gone to the devil." There was something in the ring of Roderick's voice as he uttered these words which sent them home with convincing force. He was not talking for effect, or the mere sensuous pleasure of extravagant and paradoxical utterance, as had often enough been the case ere this. He was not even talking viciously or ill-humouredly. He was talking passionately, desperately, and from an irresistible need to throw off the oppressive burden of his mother's confidence. His cruel eloquence brought the poor lady to her feet, and she stood there with clasped hands, petrified and voiceless. Mary Garland quickly left her place, came straight to Roderick, and laid her hand on his arm, looking at him with all her tormented heart in her eyes. He made no movement to disengage himself. He simply shook his head several times in dogged negation of her healing powers. Rowland had been living for the past month in such intolerable expectancy of disaster that now that the ice was broken and the fatal plunge taken, his foremost feeling was almost elation, but in a moment his orderly instincts and his natural love of superficial smoothness overtook it. "I really don't see, Roderick," he said, "the profit of your talking in just this way at just this time. Don't you see how you are making your mother suffer?" "Do I enjoy it myself?" cried Roderick. "Is the suffering all on your side and theirs? Do I look as if I were happy, and were stirring you up with a stick for my amusement? Here we all are in the same boat; we might as well understand each other. These women must know that I'm not to be counted on. That sounds remarkably cool, no doubt, and I certainly don't deny your right to be utterly disgusted with me." "Will you keep what you have got to say till another time," said Mary, "and let me hear it alone?" "Oh, I'll let you hear it as often as you please. But what's the use of keeping it? I'm in the humour. It won't keep. It's a very simple matter. I'm a failure, that's all. I'm not a first-rate man. I'm a second-rate, tenth-rate, anything you please. After that it's all one." Mary Garland turned away and buried her face in her hands; but Roderick, struck apparently in some unwonted fashion with her gesture, drew her towards him again, and went on in a somewhat different tone. "It's hardly worth while we should have any private talk about this, Mary," he said. "The thing would be comfortable for neither of us. It's better, after all, that it be said once for all and dismissed. There are things I can't talk to you about. Can I, at least? You are such a queer creature." "I can imagine nothing you shouldn't talk to me about," said Mary. "You are not afraid?" he demanded sharply, looking at her. She turned away abruptly with lowered eyes, hesitating a moment. "Anything you think I should hear, I will hear," she said. And then she returned to her place at the window, and took up her work. "I have had a great blow," said Roderick. "I was a great ass, but it doesn't make the blow any easier to bear." "Mr. Mallet, tell me what Roderick means," said Mrs. Hudson, who had found her voice, in a tone more peremptory than Rowland had ever heard her use. "He ought to have told you before," said Roderick. "Really, Rowland, if you will allow me to say so, you ought. You could have given a much better account of all this than I myself; better, especially, in that it would have been more lenient to me. You ought to have let them down gently. It would have saved them a great deal of pain. But you always want to keep things so smooth. Allow me to say that it's very weak of you." "I hereby renounce such weakness," said Rowland. "Oh, what is it, sir, what is it?" groaned Mrs. Hudson, insistently. "It's what Roderick says. He's a failure." Mary Garland, on hearing this declaration, gave Rowland a single glance and then rose, laid down her work, and walked rapidly out of the room. Mrs. Hudson tossed her head and timidly bristled. "This from you, Mr. Mallet," she said, with an injured air which Rowland found harrowing. But Roderick, most characteristically, did not in the least resent his friend's assertion. He sent him, on the contrary, one of those large, clear looks of his, which seemed to express a stoical pleasure in Rowland's frankness, and which set his companion, then and there, wondering again, as he had so often done before, at the extraordinary contradictions of his temperament. "My dear mother," Roderick said, If you had had eyes that were not blinded by this sad maternal vanity, you would have seen all this for yourself. You would have seen that I'm anything but prosperous." "Is it anything about money?" cried Mrs. Hudson. "Oh, do write to Mr. Striker." "Money!" said Roderick. "I haven't a cent of money. I'm bankrupt." "Oh, Mr. Mallet, how could you let him?" asked Mrs. Hudson, terribly. "Everything I have is at his service," said Rowland, feeling ill. "Of course Mr. Mallet will help you, my son," cried the poor lady, eagerly. "Oh, leave Mr. Mallet alone," said Roderick. "I have squeezed him dry. It's not my fault, at least, if I haven't." "Roderick, what have you done with all your money?" his mother demanded. "Thrown it away. It was no such great amount. I have done nothing this winter." "You have done nothing?" "I have done no work. Why in the world didn't you guess it and spare me all this? Couldn't you see I was idle, distracted, dissipated?" "Dissipated, my dear son?" Mrs. Hudson repeated. "That's over for the present. But couldn't you see, couldn't Mary see, that I was in a damnably bad way?" "I have no doubt Miss Garland saw," said Rowland. "Mary has said nothing!" cried Mrs. Hudson. "Oh, she's a fine girl!" Rowland said. "Have you done anything that will hurt poor Mary?" Mrs. Hudson asked. "I have only been thinking night and day of another woman." Mrs. Hudson dropped helplessly into her seat again. "Oh, dear, dear! Hadn't we better go home?" "Not to get out of her way," Roderick said. "She has started a career of her own, and she doesn't care a straw for me. My head was filled with her. I could think of nothing else. I would have sacrificed everything to her. You, Mary, Mallet, my work, my fortune, my future, my honor. I was in a fine state, eh? I don't pretend to be giving you good news, but I'm telling the simple literal truth so that you may know why I have gone to the dogs. She pretended to care greatly for all this, and to be willing to make any sacrifice in return. She had a magnificent chance, for she was being forced into a mercenary marriage with a man she detested. She led me to believe that she would give this up and break short off, and keep herself free and sacred and pure for me. This was a great honor, and you may believe that I valued it. It turned my head, and I lived only to see my happiness come to pass. She did everything to encourage me to hope it would, everything that her infernal coquetry and falsity could suggest." "Oh, I say, this is too much!" Rowland broke out. "Do you defend her?" Roderick cried, with a renewal of his passion. "Do you pretend to say that she gave me no hopes?" He had been speaking with growing bitterness, quite losing sight of his mother's pain and bewilderment, in the passionate joy of publishing his wrongs. Since he was hurt, he must cry out. Since he was in pain, he must scatter his pain abroad. Of his never thinking of others, save as they spoke and moved from his cue, as it were, this extraordinary insensibility to the injurious effects of his eloquence was a capital example; the more so as the motive of his eloquence was never an appeal for sympathy or compassion, things to which he seemed perfectly indifferent, and of which he could make no use. The great and characteristic point with him was the perfect absoluteness of his own emotions and experience. He never saw himself as part of a whole, only as the clear-cut, sharp-edged, isolated individual, rejoicing or raging as the case might be, but needing in any case absolutely to affirm himself. All this to Rowland was ancient history, but his perception of it stirred within him afresh at the sight of Roderick's sense of having been betrayed. That he, under the circumstances, should not in fairness be the first to lodge a complaint of betrayal was a point to which, at his leisure, Rowland was of course capable of rendering impartial justice; but Roderick's present desperation was so peremptory that it imposed itself on one's sympathies. "Do you pretend to say," he went on, "that she didn't lead me along to the very edge of fulfillment, and stupefy me with all that she suffered me to believe, all that she sacredly promised? It amused her to do it, and she knew perfectly well what she really meant. She never meant to be sincere; she never dreamed she could be. She's a ravenous flirt, and why a flirt is more than I can tell you. I can't understand playing with those matters. For me, they're serious, whether I take them up or lay them down. I don't see what's in your head, Rowland, to attempt to defend Miss Light. You were the first to cry out against her. You told me she was dangerous, and I pooh-poohed you. You were right. You're always right. She's as cold and false and heartless as she's beautiful, and she has sold her heartless beauty to the highest bidder. I hope he knows what he gets." "Oh, my son!" cried Mrs. Hudson plaintively. "How could you ever care for such a dreadful creature?" "It would take long to tell you, dear mother." Rowland's lately deepened sympathy and compassion for Christina was still throbbing in his mind, and he felt that in loyalty to it he must say a word for her. "You believed in her too much at first," he declared, "and you believe in her too little now." Roderick looked at him with eyes almost lurid beneath lowering brows. "She is an angel, then, after all? That's what you want to prove?" he cried. "That's consoling for me, who have lost her. You're always right, I say; but, dear friend, in mercy, be wrong for once." "Oh yes, Mr. Mallet, be merciful," said Mrs. Hudson, in a tone which, for all its gentleness, made Rowland stare. The poor fellow's stare covered a great deal of concentrated wonder and apprehension, a presentiment of what a small, sweet, feeble, elderly lady might be capable of, in the way of suddenly generated animosity. There was no space in Mrs. Hudson's tiny maternal mind for complications of feeling, and one emotion existed only by turning another over flat and perching on top of it. She was evidently not following Roderick at all in his dusky aberrations. Sitting without, in dismay, she only saw that all was darkness and trouble, and as Roderick's glory had now quite outstripped her powers of imagination and urged him beyond her jurisdiction, so that he had become a thing too precious and sacred for blame, she found it infinitely comfortable to lay the burden of their common affliction upon Rowland's broad shoulders. Had he not promised to make them all rich and happy? And was this the end of it? Rowland felt as if his trials were, in a sense, only beginning. "Hadn't you better forget all this, my dear?" Mrs. Hudson said. "Hadn't you better just quietly attend to your work?" "Work, madam!" cried Roderick. "My work's over. I can't work. I haven't worked all winter. If I were fit for anything, this sentimental collapse would have been just the thing to cure me of my apathy and break the spell of my idleness. But there's a perfect vacuum here," and he tapped his forehead. "It's bigger than ever. It grows bigger every hour." "I am sure you have made a beautiful likeness of your poor little mother," said Mrs. Hudson coaxingly. "I had done nothing before, and I have done nothing since. I quarreled with an excellent man the other day from mere exasperation of my nerves, and threw away $5,000. Threw away $5,000! Roderick had been wandering among formidable abstractions and illusions too dark to penetrate, but here was a concrete fact, lucidly stated, and poor Mrs. Hudson for a moment looked it in the face. She repeated her son's words a third time with a gasping murmur, and then suddenly she burst into tears. Roderick went to her, sat down beside her, put his arm round her, fixed his eyes coldly on the floor, and waited for her to weep herself out. She leaned her head on his shoulder and sobbed broken heartedly. She said not a word, she made no attempt to scold, but the desolation of her tears was overwhelming. It lasted some time, too long for Rowland's courage. He had stood silent, wishing simply to appear very respectful, but the elation that was mentioned a while since had utterly ebbed, and he found his situation intolerable. He walked away, not perhaps on tiptoe, but with a total absence of bravado in his tread. The next day, while he was at home, the servant brought him the card of a visitor. He read with surprise the name of Mrs. Hudson, and hurried forward to meet her. He found her in his sitting room, leaning on the arm of her son, and looking very pale, her eyes red with weeping, and her lips tightly compressed. Her advent puzzled him, and it was not for some time that he began to understand the motive of it. Roderick's countenance threw no light upon it, but Roderick's countenance, full of light as it was, in a way, itself, had never thrown light upon anything. He had not been in Rowland's rooms for several weeks, and he immediately began to look at those of his own works that adorned them. He lost himself in silent contemplation. Mrs. Hudson had evidently armed herself with dignity, and so far as she might, she meant to be impressive. Her success may be measured by the fact that Rowland's whole attention centered in the fear of seeing her begin to weep. She told him that she had come to him for practical advice. She begged to remind him that she was a stranger in the land. Where were they to go, please? What were they to do? Rowland glanced at Roderick, but Roderick had his back turned, and was gazing at his Adam with the intensity with which he might have examined Michelangelo's Moses. "Roderick says he doesn't know, he doesn't care," Mrs. Hudson said. "He leaves it entirely to you." Many another man, in Rowland's place, would have greeted this information with an irate and sarcastic laugh, and told his visitors that he thanked them infinitely for their confidence, but that really as things stood now they must settle these matters between themselves. Many another man might have so demeaned himself, even if, like Rowland, he had been in love with Mary Garland, and pressingly conscious that her destiny was also part of the question. But Rowland swallowed all hilarity and all sarcasm, and let himself seriously consider Mrs. Hudson's petition. His wits, however, were but indifferently at his command. They were dulled by his sense of the inexpressible change in Mrs. Hudson's attitude. Her visit was evidently intended as a formal reminder of the responsibilities Rowland had worn so lightly. Mrs. Hudson was doubtless too sincerely humble a person to suppose that if he had been recreant to his vows of vigilance and tenderness, her still small presence would operate as a chastisement. But by some diminutive logical process of her own she had convinced herself that she had been weakly trustful, and that she had suffered Rowland to think too meanly, not only of her understanding, but of her social consequence. A visit in her best gown would have an admonitory effect as regards both of these attributes. It would cancel some favors received, and show him that she was no such fool. These were the reflections of a very shy woman, who, determining for once in her life to hold up her head, was perhaps carrying it a trifle extravagantly. "You know we have very little money to spend," she said, as Rowland remained silent. "Roderick tells me that he has debts and nothing at all to pay them with. He says I must write to Mr. Striker to sell my house for what it will bring, and send me out the money. When the money comes, I must give it to him. I'm sure I don't know. I never heard of anything so dreadful. My house is all I have. But that is all Roderick will say. We must be very economical." Before this speech was finished, Mrs. Hudson's voice had begun to quaver softly, and her face, which had no capacity for the expression of superior wisdom, to look as humbly appealing as before. Rowland turned to Roderick and spoke like a schoolmaster. "Come away from those statues and sit down here and listen to me." Roderick started, but obeyed with the most graceful docility. "What do you propose to your mother to do?" Rowland asked. "Propose?" said Roderick absently. "Oh, I propose nothing." The tone, the glance, the gesture with which this was said were horribly irritating, though obviously without the slightest intention of being so, and for an instant an imprecation rose to Rowland's lips. But he checked it, and he was afterwards glad he had done so. "You must do something," he said. "Choose, select, decide." "My dear Rowland, how you talk!" Roderick cried. "The very point of the matter is that I can't do anything. I will do as I'm told, but I don't call that doing. We must leave Rome, I suppose, though I don't see why. We have got no money, and you have to pay money on the railroads." Mrs. Hudson surreptitiously wrung her hands. "Listen to him, please!" she cried. "Not leave Rome, when we have stayed here later than any Christians ever did before! It's this dreadful place that has made us so unhappy." "That's very true," said Roderick serenely. "If I had not come to Rome, I wouldn't have risen, and if I had not risen, I shouldn't have fallen." "Fallen, fallen!" murmured Mrs. Hudson. "Just hear him." "I will do anything you say, Rowland," Roderick added. "I will do anything you want. I have not been unkind to my mother. Have I, mother? I was unkind yesterday, without meaning it, for after all that had to be said. Murder will out, and my low spirits can't be hidden. But we talked it over and made it up, didn't we? It seemed to me we did. Let Rowland decide it, mother. Whatever he suggests will be the right thing." And Roderick, who had hardly removed his eyes from the statues, got up again and went back to look at them. Mrs. Hudson fixed her eyes upon the floor in silence. There was not a trace in Roderick's face, or in his voice, of the bitterness of his emotion of the day before, and not a hint of his having the lightest weight upon his conscience. He looked at Rowland with his frank, luminous eye, as if there had never been a difference of opinion between them, as if each had ever been for both unalterably, and both for each. Rowland had received a few days before a letter from a lady of his acquaintance, a worthy Scotswoman domiciled in a villa upon one of the olive-covered hills near Florence. She held her apartment in the villa upon a long lease, and she enjoyed for a sum not worth mentioning the possession of an extraordinary number of noble stone-floored rooms, with ceilings vaulted and frescoed, and barred windows commanding the loveliest view in the world. She was a needy and thrifty spinster, who never hesitated to declare that the lovely view was all very well, but that for her own part she lived in the villa for cheapness, and that if she had a clear £300 a year, she would go and really enjoy life near her sister, a baronet's lady at Glasgow. She was now proposing to make a visit to that exhilarating city, and she desired to turn an honest penny by subletting for a few weeks her historic Italian chambers. The terms on which she occupied them enabled her to ask a rent almost jocosely small, and she begged Rowland to do what she called a little genteel advertising for her. Would he say a good word for her rooms to his numerous friends as they left Rome? He said a good word for them now to Mrs. Hudson, and told her in dollars and cents how cheap a summer's lodging she might secure. He dwelt upon the fact that she would strike a truce with the table d'hote, and have a cook of her own, amenable possibly to instruction in the Northampton mysteries. He had touched a tender chord. Mrs. Hudson became almost cheerful. Her sentiments upon the table d'hote system, and upon foreign household habits generally, were remarkable, and if we had space for it, would repay analysis, and the idea of reclaiming a lost soul to the puritanic canons of cookery quite lightened the burden of her depression. While Rowland set forth his case, Roderick was slowly walking round the magnificent Adam, with his hands in his pockets. Rowland waited for him to manifest an interest in their discussion, but the statue seemed to fascinate him, and he remained calmly heedless. Rowland was a practical man. He possessed conspicuously what is called the sense of detail. He entered into Mrs. Hudson's position minutely, and told her exactly why it seemed good that she should remove immediately to the Florentine villa. She received his advice with great frigidity, looking hard at the floor, and sighing like a person well on her guard against an insidious optimism. But she had nothing better to propose, and Rowland received her permission to write to his friend that he had let the rooms. End of Chapter 11, Part A. Chapter 11, Part B, of Roderick Hudson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Roderick assented to this decision without either sighs or smiles. "A Florentine villa is a good thing," he said. "I am at your service." "I'm sure I hope you'll get better there," moaned his mother, gathering her shawl together. Roderick laid one hand on her arm, and with the other pointed to Rowland's statues. "Better or worse, remember this: I did those things," he said. Mrs. Hudson gazed at them vaguely, and Rowland said, "Remember it yourself." "They are horribly good," said Roderick. Rowland solemnly shrugged his shoulders. It seemed to him that he had nothing more to say; but as the others were going, a last light pulsation of the sense of undischarged duty led him to address to Roderick a few words of parting advice. "You'll find the Villa Pandolfini very delightful, very comfortable," he said. "You ought to be very contented there. Whether you work or whether you loaf, it's a place for an artist to be happy in. I hope you will work." "I hope I may," said Roderick, with a magnificent smile. "When we meet again, have something to show me." "When we meet again? Where the deuce are you going?" Roderick demanded. "Oh, I hardly know. Over the Alps." "Over the Alps? You 're going to leave me?" Roderick cried. Rowland had most distinctly meant to leave him, but his resolution immediately wavered. He glanced at Mrs. Hudson and saw that her eyebrows were lifted and her lips parted in soft irony. She seemed to accuse him of a craven shirking of trouble. to demand of him to repair his cruel havoc in her life by a solemn renewal of zeal. But Roderick's expectations were the oddest. Such as they were, Rowland asked himself why he shouldn't make a bargain with him. "You desire me to go with you?" he asked. "If you don't go, I won't, that's all. How in the world shall I get through the summer without you? How will you get through it with me? That's the question." "I don't pretend to say. The future is a dead blank. But without you it's not a blank, it's certain damnation." "Mercy, mercy!" murmured Mrs. Hudson. Rowland made an effort to stand firm, and for a moment succeeded. "If I go with you, will you try to work?" Roderick, up to this moment, had been looking as unperturbed as if the deep agitation of the day before were a thing of the remote past. But at these words his face changed formidably. He flushed and scowled, and all his passion returned. "Try to work!" he cried. "Try, try! Work, work! In God's name, don't talk that way or you'll drive me mad. Do you suppose I'm trying not to work? Do you suppose I stand rotting here for the fun of it? Don't you suppose I would try to work for myself before I tried for you?" "Mr. Mallet," cried Mrs. Hudson, piteously, "will you leave me alone with this?" Rowland turned to her and informed her gently that he would go with her to Florence. After he had so pledged himself, he thought not at all of the pain of his position as mediator between the mother's resentful grief and the son's incurable weakness. He drank deep, only, of the satisfaction of not separating from Mary Garland. If the future was a blank to Roderick, it was hardly less so to himself. He had at moments a lively foreboding of impending calamity. He paid it no especial deference, but it made him feel indisposed to take the future into his account. When, on his going to take leave of Madame Grandoni, this lady asked at what time he would come back to Rome, he answered that he was coming back either never or forever. When she asked him what he meant, he said he really couldn't tell her, and parted from her with much genuine emotion, the more so, doubtless, that she blessed him in a quite loving maternal fashion, and told him she honestly believed him to be the best fellow in the world. The Villa Pandolfini stood directly upon a small grass grown piazza, on the top of a hill which sloped straight from one of the gates of Florence. It offered to the outer world a long, rather low facade, colored a dull dark yellow, and pierced with windows of various sizes, no one of which, save those on the ground floor, was on the same level with any other. Within, it had a great cool gray cortile, with high light arches around it, heavily corniced doors of majestic altitude opening out of it, and a beautiful medieval well on one side of it. Mrs. Hudson's rooms opened into a small garden supported on immense substructions, which were planted on the farther side of the hill as it sloped steeply away. The garden was a charming place. Its south wall was curtained with a dense orange vine, a dozen fig trees offered you their large leaved shade, and over the low parapet the soft, grave Tuscan landscape kept you company. The rooms themselves were as high as chapels and as cool as royal sepulchres. Silence, peace, and security seemed to abide in the ancient house and make it an ideal refuge for aching hearts. Mrs. Hudson had a stunted, brown-faced Maddalena, who wore a crimson handkerchief passed over her coarse black locks and tied under her sharp, pertinacious chin, and a smile which was as brilliant as a prolonged flash of lightning. She smiled at everything in life, especially the things she didn't like and which kept her talent for mendacity in healthy exercise. A glance, a word, a motion, was sufficient to make her show her teeth at you like a cheerful she-wolf. This inexpugnable smile constituted her whole vocabulary in her dealings with her melancholy mistress, to whom she had been bequeathed by the late occupant of the apartment, and who, to Rowland's satisfaction, promised to be diverted from her maternal sorrows by the still deeper perplexities of Maddalena's theory of roasting, sweeping, and bed-making. Rowland took rooms at a villa a trifle nearer Florence, whence in the summer mornings he had 5 minutes' walk in the sharp, black shadow strip projected by winding, flower-topped walls to join his friends. The life at the Villa Pandolfini when it had fairly defined itself, was tranquil and monotonous, but it might have borrowed from exquisite circumstance an absorbing charm. If a sensible shadow rested upon it, this was because it had an inherent vice; it was feigning a repose which it very scantily felt. Roderick had lost no time in giving the full measure of his uncompromising chagrin, and as he was the central figure of the little group, as he held its heartstrings all in his own hand, it reflected faithfully the eclipse of his own genius. No one had ventured upon the cheerful commonplace of saying that the change of air and of scene would restore his spirits. This would have had, under the circumstances, altogether too silly a sound. The change in question had done nothing of the sort, and his companions had at least the comfort of their perspicacity. An essential spring had dried up within him, and there was no visible spiritual law for making it flow again. He was rarely violent; he expressed little of the irritation and ennui that he must have constantly felt. It was as if he believed that a spiritual miracle for his redemption was just barely possible, and was therefore worth waiting for. The most that one could do, however, was to wait grimly and doggedly, suppressing an imprecation as from time to time one looked at one's watch. An attitude of positive urbanity toward life was not to be expected. It was doing one's duty to hold one's tongue, and to keep one's hands off one's own windpipe and other people's. Roderick had long silences, fits of profound lethargy, almost of stupefaction. He used to sit in the garden by the hour, with his head thrown back, his legs outstretched, his hands in his pockets, and his eyes fastened upon the blinding summer sky. He would gather a dozen books about him, tumble them out on the ground, take one into his lap, and leave it with the pages unturned. These moods would alternate with hours of extreme restlessness, during which he mysteriously absented himself. He bore the heat of the Italian summer like a salamander, and used to start off at high noon for long walks over the hills. He often went down into Florence, rambled through her close, dim streets, and lounged away mornings in the churches and galleries. On many of these occasions Rowland bore him company, for they were the times which he was most like his former self. Before Michelangelo's statues and the pictures of the early Tuscans he quite forgot his own infelicities, and picked up the thread of his old aesthetic loquacity. He had a particular fondness for Andrea del Sarto, and affirmed that if he had been a painter he would have taken the author of the Madonna del Sacco for his model. He found in Florence some of his Roman friends, and went down on certain evenings to meet them. More than once he asked Mary Garland to go with him into town, and showed her the things he most cared for. He had some modeling clay brought up to the villa, and deposited in a room suitable for his work, but when this had been done he turned the key in the door, and the clay never was touched. His eye was heavy and his hand cold, and his mother put up a secret prayer that he might be induced to see a doctor. But on a certain occasion, when her prayer became articulate, he had a great outburst of anger, and begged her to know, once for all, that his health was better than it had ever been. On the whole, and most of the time, he was a sad spectacle; he looked so hopelessly idle. If he was not querulous and bitter, it was because he had taken an extraordinary vow not to be; a vow heroic for him, a vow which those who knew him well had the tenderness to appreciate. Talking with him was like skating on thin ice, and his companions had a constant mental vision of spots designated "dangerous." This was a difficult time for Rowland. He said to himself that he would endure it to the end, but that it must be his last adventure of the kind. Mrs. Hudson divided her time between looking askance at her son, with her hands tightly clasped about her pocket handkerchief, as if she were wringing it dry of the last hour's tears, and turning her eyes much more directly upon Rowland, in the mutest, the feeblest, the most intolerable reproachfulness. She never phrased her accusations, but he felt that in the unillumined void of the poor lady's mind they loomed up like vaguely outlined monsters. Her demeanour caused him the acutest suffering, and if at the outset of his enterprise he had seen, how dimly soever, one of those plaintive eye beams in the opposite scale, the brilliancy of Roderick's promises would have counted for little. They made their way to the softest spot in his conscience, and kept it chronically aching. If Mrs. Hudson had been loquacious and vulgar, he would have borne even a less valid persecution with greater fortitude. But somehow, neat and noiseless and dismally ladylike as she sat there, keeping her grievance green with her soft dropping tears, her displeasure conveyed an overwhelming imputation of brutality. He felt like a reckless trustee who has speculated with the widow's mite, and is haunted with the reflection of ruin that he sees in her tearful eyes. He did everything conceivable to be polite to Mrs. Hudson, and to treat her with distinguished deference. Perhaps his exasperated nerves made him overshoot the mark, and rendered his civilities a trifle peremptory. She seemed capable of believing that he was trying to make a fool of her. She would have thought him cruelly recreant if he had suddenly departed in desperation, and yet she gave him no visible credit for his constancy. Women are said by some authorities to be cruel. I don't know how true this is, but it may at least be pertinent to remark that Mrs. Hudson was very much of a woman. It often seemed to Rowland that he had too decidedly forfeited his freedom, and that there was something positively grotesque in a man of his age and circumstances living in such a moral bondage. But Mary Garland had helped him before, and she helped him now; helped him not less than he had assured himself she would when he found himself drifting to Florence. Yet her help was rendered in the same unconscious, unacknowledged fashion as before. There was no explicit change in their relations. After that distressing scene in Rome which had immediately preceded their departure, it was of course impossible that there should not be on Miss Garland's part some frankness of allusion to Roderick's sad condition. She had been present, the reader will remember, during only half of his unsparing confession, and Rowland had not seen her confronted with any absolute proof of Roderick's passion for Christina Light. But he knew that she knew far too much for her happiness. Roderick had told him, shortly after their settlement at the Villa Pandolfini, that he had had a tremendous talk with his cousin. Rowland asked no questions about it; he preferred not to know what passed between them. If their interview had been purely painful, he wished to ignore it for Miss Garland's sake; and if it had sown the seeds of reconciliation, he wished to close his eyes to it for his own, for the sake of that unshaped idea, for ever dismissed and yet for ever present, which hovered in the background of his consciousness, with a hanging head, as it were, and yet an unshamed glance, and whose lightest motions were an effectual bribe to patience. Was the engagement broken, Rowland wondered, yet without asking? But it hardly mattered, for if, as was more than probable, Miss Garland had peremptorily released her cousin, her own heart had by no means recovered its liberty. It was very certain to Rowland's mind that if she had given him up, she had by no means ceased to care for him passionately, and that, to exhaust her charity for his weaknesses, Roderick would have, as the phrase is, a long row to hoe. She spoke of Roderick as she might have done of a person suffering from a serious malady which demanded much tenderness. But if Rowland had found it possible to accuse her of dishonesty, he would have said now that she believed appreciably less than she pretended to in her victim's being an involuntary patient. There are women whose love is caretaking and patronizing, and who rather prefer a weak man because he gives them a comfortable sense of strength. It did not in the least please Rowland to believe that Mary Garland was one of these, for he held that such women were only males in petticoats, and he was convinced that Miss Garland's heart was constructed after the most perfect female model. That she was a very different woman from Christina Light did not at all prove that she was less a woman; and if the Princess Casamassima had gone up into a high place to publish her disrelish of a man who lacked the virile will, it was very certain that Mary Garland was not a person to put up, at any point, with what might be called the princess's leavings. It was Christina's constant practice to remind you of the complexity of her character, of the subtlety of her mind, of her troublous faculty of seeing everything in a dozen different lights. Mary Garland had never pretended not to be simple, but Rowland had a theory that she had really a more multitudinous sense of human things, a more delicate imagination, and a finer instinct of character. She did you the honours of her mind with a grace far less regal, but was not that faculty of quite as remarkable an adjustment? If in poor Christina's strangely commingled nature there was circle within circle and depth beneath depth, it was to be believed that Mary Garland, though she did not amuse herself with dropping stones into her soul and waiting to hear them fall, laid quite as many sources of spiritual life under contribution. She had believed Roderick was a fine fellow when she bade him farewell beneath the Northampton elms, and this belief, to her young, strenuous, concentrated imagination, had meant many things. If it was to grow cold, it would be because disenchantment had become total and won the battle at each successive point. Miss Garland had even in her face and carriage something of the preoccupied and wearied look of a person who is watching at a sick bed. Roderick's broken fortunes, his dead ambitions, were a cruel burden to the heart of a girl who had believed that he possessed genius, and supposed that genius was to one's spiritual economy what full pockets were to one's domestic. And yet with her Rowland never felt, as with Mrs. Hudson, that undercurrent of reproach and bitterness toward himself, that impertinent implication that he had defrauded her of happiness. Was this justice in Miss Garland, or was it mercy? The answer would have been difficult, for she had almost let Rowland feel before leaving Rome that she liked him well enough to forgive him an injury. It was partly, Rowland fancied, that there were occasional lapses, deep and sweet, in her sense of injury. When, on arriving at Florence, she saw the place Rowland had brought them to in their trouble, she had given him a look and said a few words to him that had seemed not only a remission of guilt, but a positive reward. This happened in the court of the villa, the large gray quadrangle overstretched from edge to edge of the red tiled roof by the soft Italian sky. Mary had felt on the spot the sovereign charm of the place; it was reflected in her deeply intelligent glance, and Rowland immediately accused himself of not having done the villa justice. Miss Garland took a mighty fancy to Florence, and used to look down wistfully at the towered city from the windows and garden. Roderick having now no pretext for not being her cicerone, Rowland was no longer at liberty, as he had been in Rome, to propose frequent excursions to her. Roderick's own invitations, however, were not frequent, and Rowland more than once ventured to introduce her to a gallery or a church. These expeditions were not so blissful, to his sense, as the rambles they had taken together in Rome, for his companion only half surrendered herself to enjoyment, and seemed to have but a divided attention at her command. Often, when she had begun with looking intently at a picture, her silence after an interval made him turn and glance at her. He usually found that if she was looking at the picture still, she was not seeing it. Her eyes were fixed, but her thoughts were wandering, and an image more vivid than any that Raphael or Titian had drawn had superposed itself upon the canvas. She asked fewer questions than before, and seemed to have lost heart for consulting guide-books and encyclopedias. From time to time, however, she uttered a deep, full murmur of gratification. Florence in midsummer was perfectly void of travellers, and the dense little city gave forth its aesthetic aroma with a larger frankness, as the nightingale sings when the listeners have departed. The churches were deliciously cool, but the gray streets were stifling, and the great dove-tailed polygons of pavement as hot to the tread as molten lava. Rowland, who suffered from intense heat, would have found all this uncomfortable in solitude, but Florence had never charmed him so completely as during these midsummer strolls with his preoccupied companion. One evening they had arranged to go on the morrow to the Academy. Miss Garland kept her appointment, but as soon as she appeared, Rowland saw that something painful had befallen her. She was doing her best to look at her ease, but her face bore the marks of tears. Rowland told her that he was afraid she was ill, and that if she preferred to give up the visit to Florence he would submit with what grace he might. She hesitated a moment, and then she said she preferred to adhere to their plan. "I am not well," she presently added, "but it's a moral malady, and in such cases I consider your company beneficial." "But if I am to be your doctor," said Rowland, "you must tell me how your illness began." "I can tell you very little. It began with Mrs. Hudson being unjust to me for the first time in her life. And now I am already better." I mention this incident because it confirmed an impression of Rowland's from which he had derived a certain consolation. He knew that Mrs. Hudson considered her son's ill regulated passion for Christina Light a very regrettable affair, but he suspected that her manifest compassion had been all for Roderick, and not in the least for Mary Garland. She was fond of the young girl, but she had valued her primarily, during the last 2 years, as a kind of assistant priestess at Roderick's shrine. Roderick had honored her by asking her to become his wife, but that poor Mary had any rights in consequence, Mrs. Hudson was quite incapable of perceiving. Her sentiment on the subject was of course not very vigorously formulated, but she was unprepared to admit that Miss Garland had any ground for complaint. Roderick was very unhappy; that was enough, and Mary's duty was to join her patience and her prayers to those of his doting mother. Roderick might fall in love with whom he pleased; no doubt that women trained in the mysterious Roman arts were only too proud and too happy to make it easy for him, and it was very presuming in poor plain Mary to feel any personal resentment. Mrs. Hudson's philosophy was of too narrow a scope to suggest that a mother may forgive where a mistress cannot, and she thought herself greatly aggrieved that Miss Garland was not so disinterested as herself. She was ready to drop dead in Roderick's service, and she was quite capable of seeing her companion falter and grow faint without a tremor of compassion. Mary, apparently, had given some intimation of her belief that if constancy is the flower of devotion, reciprocity is the guarantee of constancy, and Mrs. Hudson had rebuked her failing faith and called it cruelty. That Miss Garland had found it hard to reason with Mrs. Hudson, that she suffered deeply from the elder lady's softly bitter imputations, and that, in short, he had companionship in misfortune, all this made Rowland find a certain luxury in his discomfort. The party at Villa Pandolfini used to sit in the garden in the evenings, which Rowland almost always spent with them. Their entertainment was in the heavily perfumed air, in the dim far starlight, in the crenellated tower of a neighboring villa, which loomed vaguely above them in the warm darkness, and in such conversation as depressing reflections allowed. Roderick, clad always in white, roamed about like a restless ghost, silent for the most part, but making from time to time a brief observation characterized by the most fantastic cynicism. Roderick's contributions to the conversation were indeed always so fantastic that though half the time they wearied him unspeakably, Rowland made an effort to treat them humorously. With Rowland alone Roderick talked a great deal more, often about things related to his own work, or about artistic and aesthetic matters in general. He talked as well as ever, or even better, but his talk always ended in a torrent of groans and curses. When this current set in, Rowland straightway turned his back or stopped his ears, and Roderick now witnessed these movements with perfect indifference. When the latter was absent from the starlit circle in the garden, as often happened, Rowland knew nothing of his whereabouts. He supposed him to be in Florence, but he never learned what he did there. All this was not enlivening, but with an even, muffled tread the days followed each other, and brought the month of August to a close. One particular evening at this time was most enchanting. There was a perfect moon, looking so extraordinarily large that it made everything its light fell upon seem small. The heat was tempered by a soft west wind, and the wind was laden with the odors of the early harvest. The hills, the vale of the Arno, the shrunken river, the domes of Florence, were vaguely effaced by the dense moonshine. They looked as if they were melting out of sight like an exorcised vision. Rowland had found the two ladies alone at the villa, and he had sat with them for an hour. He felt absolutely hushed by the solemn splendor of the scene, but he had risked the remark that whatever life might yet have in store for either of them, this was a night they would never forget. "It's a night to remember on one's deathbed!" Miss Garland exclaimed. "Oh, Mary, how can you?" murmured Mrs. Hudson, to whom this savoured of profanity, and to whose shrinking sense, indeed, the accumulated loveliness of the night seemed to have something shameless and defiant. They were silent after this for some time, but at last Rowland addressed certain idle words to Miss Garland. She made no reply, and he turned to look at her. She was sitting motionless, with her head pressed to Mrs. Hudson's shoulder, and the latter lady was gazing at him through the silvered dusk with a look which gave a sort of spectral solemnity to the sad, weak meaning of her eyes. She had the air, for the moment, of a little old malevolent fairy. Miss Garland, Rowland perceived in an instant, was not absolutely motionless. A tremor passed through her figure. She was weeping, or on the point of weeping, and she could not trust herself to speak. Rowland left his place and wandered to another part of the garden, wondering at the motive of her sudden tears. Of women's sobs in general he had a sovereign dread, but these, somehow, gave him a certain pleasure. When he returned to his place Miss Garland had raised her head and banished her tears. She came away from Mrs. Hudson, and they stood for a short time leaning against the parapet. "It seems to you very strange, I suppose," said Rowland, "that there should be any trouble in such a world as this." "I used to think," she answered, "that if any trouble came to me, I would bear it like a stoic. But that was at home, where things don't speak to us of enjoyment as they do here. Here it is such a mixture; one doesn't know what to choose, what to believe. Beauty stands there, beauty such as this night and this place, and all this sad, strange summer have been so full of. And it penetrates to one's soul and lodges there, and keeps saying that man was not made to suffer, but to enjoy. This place has undermined my stoicism, but, shall I tell you, I feel as if I were saying something sinful. I love it." "If it is sinful, I absolve you," said Rowland, "in so far as I have power. We are made, I suppose, both to suffer and to enjoy. As you say, it's a mixture. Just now and here it seems a particularly strange one. But we must take things in turn." His words had a singular aptness, for he had hardly uttered them when Roderick came out from the house, evidently in his darkest mood. He stood for a moment gazing hard at the view. "It's a very beautiful night, my son," said his mother, going to him timidly and touching his arm. He passed his hand through his hair and let it stay there, clasping his thick locks. "Beautiful!" he cried. "Of course it's beautiful. Everything is beautiful. Everything is insolent, defiant, atrocious with beauty. Nothing is ugly but me and my poor dead brain." "Oh, my dearest son," pleaded poor Mrs. Hudson, "don't you feel any better?" Roderick made no immediate answer, but at last he spoke in a different voice. "I came expressly to tell you that you needn't trouble yourselves any longer to wait for something to turn up. Nothing will turn up. It's all over. I said when I came here I would give it a chance. I have given it a chance. Haven't I, eh? Haven't I, Rowland? It's no use. The thing's a failure. Do with me now what you please. I recommend you to set me up there at the end of the garden and shoot me." "I feel strongly inclined," said Rowland gravely, "to go and get my revolver." "Oh, mercy on us, what language!" cried Mrs. Hudson. "Why not?" Roderick went on. "This would be a lovely night for it, and I should be a lucky fellow to be buried in this garden. But bury me alive, if you prefer. Take me back to Northampton." "Roderick, will you really come?" cried his mother. "Oh yes, I'll go. I might as well be there as anywhere, reverting to idiocy and living upon alms. I can do nothing with all this. Perhaps I should really like Northampton. If I'm to vegetate for the rest of my days, I can do it there better than here." "Oh, come home, Mrs. Hudson said, "and we shall all be safe and quiet and happy. My dearest son, come home with your poor mother." "Let us go, then, and go quickly." Mrs. Hudson flung herself upon his neck for gratitude. "We'll go to morrow," she cried. "The Lord is very good to me." Mary Garland said nothing to this, but she looked at Rowland, and her eyes seemed to contain a kind of alarmed appeal. Rowland noted it with exultation, but even without it he would have broken into an eager protest. "Are you serious, Roderick?" he demanded. "Serious? Of course not. How can a man with a crack in his brain be serious? How can a muddlehead reason? But I'm not jesting either. I can no more make jokes than utter oracles." "Are you willing to go home?" "Willing! God forbid! I am simply amenable to force. If my mother chooses to take me, I won't resist. I can't. I have come to that." "Let me resist, then," said Rowland. "Go home as you are now? I can't stand by and see it." It may have been true that Roderick had lost his sense of humour, but he scratched his head with a gesture that was almost comical in its effect. "You are a queer fellow. I should think I would disgust you horribly." "Stay another year," Rowland simply said. "Doing nothing?" "You shall do something. I am responsible for your doing something." "To whom are you responsible?" Rowland, before replying, glanced at Miss Garland, and his glance made her speak quickly. "Not to me." "I'm responsible to myself," Rowland declared. "My poor dear fellow!" said Roderick. "Oh, Mr. Mallet, aren't you satisfied?" cried Mrs. Hudson, in the tone in which Niobe may have addressed the avenging archers after she had seen her eldest born fall. "It's out of all nature keeping him here. When we're in a poor way, surely our own dear native land is the place for us. Do leave us to ourselves, sir." This just failed of being a dismissal in form, and Rowland bowed his head to it. Roderick was silent for some moments. Then suddenly he covered his face with his two hands. "Take me at least out of this terrible Italy," he cried, "where everything mocks and reproaches and torments and eludes me. Take me out of this land of impossible beauty, and put me in the midst of ugliness. Set me down where nature is coarse and flat, and men and manners are vulgar. There must be something awfully ugly in Germany. Pack me off there." Rowland answered that if he wished to leave Italy the thing might be arranged. He would think it over and submit a proposal on the morrow. He suggested to Mrs. Hudson, in consequence, that she should spend the autumn in Switzerland, where she would find a fine tonic climate, plenty of fresh milk, and several pensions at 3 francs and a half a day. Switzerland, of course, was not ugly, but one could not have everything. Mrs. Hudson neither thanked him nor assented, but she wept and packed her trunks. Rowland had a theory, after the scene which led to these preparations, that Mary Garland was weary of waiting for Roderick to come to his senses; that the faith which had bravely borne his manhood company hitherto, on the tortuous march he was leading it, had begun to believe it had gone far enough. This theory was not vitiated by something she said to him on the day before that on which Mrs. Hudson had arranged to leave Florence. "Cousin Sarah, the other evening," she said, "asked you to please leave us. I think she hardly knew what she was saying, and I hope you have not taken offense." "By no means; but I honestly believe that my leaving you would contribute greatly to Mrs. Hudson's comfort. I can be your hidden providence, you know. I can watch you at a distance, and come upon the scene at critical moments." Miss Garland looked for a moment at the ground. Then, with sudden earnestness, "I beg you to come with us," she said. It need hardly be added that after this Rowland went with them. End of Chapter 11, Part B. Chapter 12, Part A of Roderick Hudson by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, The Princess Casamassima. Rowland had a very friendly memory of a little mountain inn, accessible with moderate trouble from Lucerne, where he had once spent a blissful 10 days. He had at that time been trudging, knapsack on back, over half Switzerland, and not being, on his legs, a particularly light weight, it was no shame to him to confess that he was mortally tired. The inn of which I speak presented striking analogies with a cow stable, but in spite of this circumstance it was crowded with hungry tourists. It stood in a high, shallow valley, with flower-strewn alpine meadows sloping down to it from the base of certain rugged rocks whose outlines were grotesque against the evening sky. Rowland had seen grander places in Switzerland that pleased him less, and whenever afterwards he wished to think of Alpine opportunities at their best, he recalled this grassy concave among the mountain tops, and the August days he spent there, resting deliciously at his length in the lee of a sun-warmed boulder, with the light cool air stirring about his temples, the wafted odours of the pines in his nostrils, the tinkle of the cattle bells in his ears, the vast progression of the mountain shadows before his eyes, and a volume of Wordsworth in his pocket. His face, on the Swiss hillsides, had been scorched to within a shade of the colour nowadays called magenta, and his bed was a pallet in a loft which he shared with a German botanist of colossal stature, every inch of him quaking at an open window. These had been drawbacks to felicity, but Rowland hardly cared where or how he was lodged, for he spent the livelong day under the sky, on the crest of a slope that looked at the Jungfrau. He remembered all this on leaving Florence with his friends, and he reflected that as the mid-season was over, accommodations would be more ample and charges more modest. He communicated with his old friend the landlord, and while September was yet young, his companions established themselves under his guidance in the grassy valley. He had crossed the St. Gothard Pass with them in the same carriage. During the journey from Florence, and especially during this portion of it, the cloud that hung over the little party had been almost dissipated, and they had looked at each other, in the close contiguity of the train and the posting carriage, without either accusing or consoling glances. It was impossible not to enjoy the magnificent scenery of the Apennines and the Italian Alps, and there was a tacit agreement among the travellers to abstain from sombre illusions. The effect of this delicate compact seemed excellent. It ensured them a week's intellectual sunshine. Roderick sat and gazed out of the window with a fascinated stare, and with a perfect docility of attitude. He concerned himself not a particle about the itinerary, or about any of the wayside arrangements. He took no trouble, and he gave none. He assented to everything that was proposed, talked very little, and led for a week a perfectly contemplative life. His mother rarely removed her eyes from him, and if a while before this would have extremely irritated him, he now seemed perfectly unconscious of her observation and profoundly indifferent to anything that might befall him. They spent a couple of days on the Lake of Como, at a hotel with white porticos smothered in oleander and myrtle, and the terrace steps leading down to little boats with striped awnings. They agreed it was the earthly paradise, and they passed the mornings strolling through the perfumed alleys of classic villas, and the evenings floating in the moonlight in a circle of outlined mountains, to the music of silver trickling oars. One day in the afternoon the two men took a long stroll together. They followed the winding footway that led toward Como, close to the lakeside, past the gates of villas and the walls of vineyards, through little hamlets propped on a dozen arches, and bathing their feet in their pendant tatters in the grey-green ripple, past frescoed walls and crumbling campaniles and grassy village piazzas, and the mouth of soft ravines that wound upward, through belts of swinging vine and vaporous olive and splendid chestnut, to high ledges where white chapels gleamed amid the paler boscage, and bare cliff surfaces, with their sun-cracked lips, drank in the azure light. It was all confoundingly picturesque. It was the Italy that we know from the steel engravings and old keepsakes and annuals, from the vignettes on music sheets and the drop curtains at the theatres, an Italy that we can never confess to ourselves, in spite of our own changes and of Italy's, that we have ceased to believe in. Rowland and Roderick turned aside from the little paved footway that clambered and dipped and wound and doubled beside the lake, and stretched themselves idly beneath a fig tree on a grassy promontory. Rowland had never known anything so divinely soothing as the dreamy softness of that early autumn afternoon. The iridescent mountains shut him in, the little waves beneath him fretted the white pebbles at the laziest intervals, the festooned vines above him swayed just visibly in the all but motionless air. Roderick lay observing it all with his arms thrown back and his hands under his head. "This suits me," he said. "I could be happy here and forget everything. Why not stay here forever?" He kept his position for a long time and seemed lost in his thoughts. Rowland spoke to him, but he made vague answers, At last he closed his eyes. It seemed to Rowland also a place to stay in forever, a place for perfect oblivion of the disagreeable. Suddenly Roderick turned over on his face and buried it in his arms. There had been something passionate in his movement, but Rowland was nevertheless surprised when he at last jerked himself back into a sitting posture to perceive the trace of tears in his eyes. Roderick turned to his friend, stretching his two hands out toward the lake and mountains, and shaking them with an eloquent gesture as if his heart was too full for utterance. "Pity me, sir, pity me," he presently cried. "Look at this lovely world, and think what it must be to be dead to it." "Dead?" said Rowland. "Dead, dead, dead and buried, buried in an open grave, where you lie staring up at the sailing clouds, smelling the waving flowers, and hearing all nature live and grow above you. That's the way I feel." "I am glad to hear it," said Rowland. "Death of that sort is very near to resurrection." "It's too horrible," Roderick went on. "It has all come over me here tremendously. If I were not ashamed, I could shed a bushel of tears. For 1 hour of what I have been, I would give up anything I may be." "Never mind what you have been. Be something better." "I shall never be anything again. It's no use talking. But I don't know what secret spring has been touched since I have lain here. Something in my heart seemed suddenly to open and let in a flood of beauty and desire. I know what I have lost, and I think it horrible. Mind you, I know it, I feel it. Remember that hereafter. Don't say that he was stupefied and senseless, that his perception was dulled and his aspiration dead. Say that he trembled in every nerve with a sense of the beauty and sweetness of life, that he rebelled and protested and shrieked, that he was buried alive with his eyes open and his heart beating to madness, that he clung to every blade of grass and every wayside thorn as he passed, that it was the most horrible spectacle you ever witnessed, that it was an outrage, a murder, a massacre." "Good heavens, man, are you insane?" Rowland cried. "I have never been saner. I don't want to be bad company, and in this beautiful spot at this delightful hour it seems an outrage to break the charm. But I am bidding farewell to Italy, to beauty, to honor, to life. I only want to assure you that I know what I lose. I know it in every pulse of my heart. Here, where these things are all loveliest, I take leave of them. Farewell, farewell." During their passage of the Saint Gothard, Roderick absented himself much of the time from the carriage, and rambled far in advance, along the huge zigzags of the road. He displayed an extraordinary activity. His light weight and slender figure made him an excellent pedestrian, and his friends frequently saw him skirting the edge of plunging chasms, loosening the stones on long steep slopes, or lifting himself against the sky from the top of rocky pinnacles. Mary Garland walked a great deal, but she remained near the carriage to be with Mrs. Hudson. Rowland remained near it to be with Miss Garland. He trudged by her side up that magnificent ascent from Italy, and found himself regretting that the Alps were so low, that their trudging was not to last a week. She was exhilarated; she liked to walk. In the way of mountains, until within the last few weeks, she had seen nothing greater than Mount Holyoke, and she found that the Alps amply justified their reputation. Rowland knew that she loved nature, but he was struck afresh with the vivacity of her observation of it, and with her knowledge of plants and stones. At that season the wild flowers had mostly departed, but a few of them lingered, and Miss Garland never failed to espy them in their outlying corners. They interested her greatly; she was charmed when they were old friends, and charmed even more when they were new. She displayed a very light foot in going in quest of them, and had soon covered the front seat of the carriage with a tangle of strange vegetation. Rowland, of course, was alert in her service, and he gathered for her several botanical specimens which at first seemed inaccessible. One of these, indeed, had at first appeared easier of capture than his attempt to test it, and he had paused a moment at the base of the little peak on which it grew, measuring the risk of farther pursuit. Suddenly, as he stood there, he remembered Roderick's defiance of danger and of Miss Light at the Colosseum, and he was seized with a strong desire to test the courage of his companion. She had just scrambled up a grassy slope near him, and had seen that the flower was out of reach. As he prepared to approach it, she called to him eagerly to stop; the thing was impossible. Poor Rowland, whose passion had been terribly starved, enjoyed immensely the thought of having her care, for 3 minutes, what became of him. He was the least brutal of men, but for a moment he was perfectly indifferent to her suffering. "I can get the flower," he called to her. "Will you trust me?" "I don't want it. I would rather not have it," she cried. "Will you trust me?" he repeated, looking at her. She looked at him and then at the flower. He wondered whether she would shriek and swoon, as Miss Light had done. "I wish it were something better," she said simply, and then stood watching him while he began to clamber. Rowland was not shaped for an acrobat, and his enterprise was difficult; but he kept his wits about him, made the most of narrow footholds and coigns of vantage, and at last secured his prize. He managed to stick it into his buttonhole, and then he contrived to descend. There was more than one chance for an ugly fall, but he evaded them all. It was doubtless not gracefully done, but it was done, and that was all he had proposed to himself. He was red in the face when he offered Miss Garland the flower, and she was visibly pale. She had watched him without moving. All this had passed without the knowledge of Mrs. Hudson, who was dozing beneath the hood of the carriage. Mary Garland's eyes did not perhaps display that ardent admiration which was formerly conferred by the Queen of Beauty at a tournament, but they expressed something in which Rowland found his reward. "Why did you do that?" she asked gravely. He hesitated. He felt that it was physically possible to say, "Because I love you," but that it was not morally possible. He lowered his pitch and answered simply, "Because I wanted to do something for you." "Suppose you had fallen," said Miss Garland. "I believed I would not fall. And you believed it, I think." "I believed nothing. I simply trusted you as you asked me." "Quod erat demonstrandum," cried Rowland. "I think you know Latin." When our four friends were established in what I have called their grassy valley, there was a good deal of scrambling over slopes, both grassy and stony, a good deal of flower plucking on narrow ledges, a great many long walks, and, thanks to the lucid mountain air, not a little exhilaration. Mrs. Hudson was obliged to intermit her suspicions of the deleterious atmosphere of the old world, and to acknowledge the edifying purity of the breezes of Engelthal. She was certainly more placid than she had been in Italy; having always lived in the country, she had missed in Rome and Florence that social solitude mitigated by bushes and rocks which is so dear to the true New England temperament. The little unpainted inn at Engelthal, with its plank partitions, its milk pans standing in the sun, its help, in the form of angular young women of the countryside, reminded her of places of summer sojourn in her native land; and the beautiful historic chambers of the Villa Pandolfini passed from her memory without a regret, and without having in the least modified her ideal of domiciliary grace. Roderick had changed his sky, but he had not changed his mind. His humour was still that of which he had given Rowland a glimpse in that tragic explosion on the Lake of Como. He kept his despair to himself, and he went doggedly about the ordinary business of life; but it was easy to see that his spirit was mortally heavy, and that he lived and moved and talked simply from the force of habit. In that sad half hour among the Italian olives there had been such a fierce sincerity in his tone that Rowland began to abdicate the critical attitude. He began to feel that it was essentially vain to appeal to the poor fellow's will. There was no will left. Its place was an impotent void. This view of the case, indeed, was occasionally contravened by certain indications on Roderick's part of the power of resistance to disagreeable obligations. One might still have said, if one had been disposed to be didactic at any hazard, that there was a method in his madness, that his moral energy had its sleeping and its waking hours, and that, in a cause that pleased it, it was capable of rising with the dawn. But on the other hand, pleasure in this case was quite at one with effort. Evidently the greatest bliss in life for Roderick would have been to have a plastic idea. And then it was impossible not to feel tenderly to a despair which had so ceased to be aggressive, not to forgive a great deal of apathy to a temper which had so unlearned its irritability. Roderick said frankly that Switzerland made him less miserable than Italy, and the Alps seemed less to mock at his enforced leisure than the Apennines. He indulged in long rambles, generally alone, and was very fond of climbing into dizzy places where no sound could overtake him, and there flinging himself on the never trodden moss, of pulling his hat over his eyes and lounging away the hours in perfect immobility. Rowland sometimes walked with him. Though Roderick never invited him, he seemed duly grateful for his society. Rowland now made it a rule to treat him like a perfectly sane man, to assume that all things were well with him, and never to allude to the prosperity he had forfeited or to the work he was not doing. He would have still said, had you questioned him, that Roderick's condition was a mood, certainly a puzzling one. It might last yet for many a weary hour, but it was a long lane that had no turning. Roderick's blues would not last for ever. Rowland's interest in Miss Garland's relations with her cousin was still profoundly attentive, and perplexed as he was on all sides, he found nothing transparent here. After their arrival at Engelthal, Roderick appeared to seek the young girl's society more than he had done hitherto, and this revival of ardor could not fail to set his friend a wondering. They sat together and strolled together, and Miss Garland often read aloud to him. One day, on their coming to dinner, after he had been lying half the morning at her feet in the shadow of a rock, Rowland asked him what she had been reading. "I don't know," Roderick said. "I don't heed the sense." Miss Garland heard this, and Rowland looked at her. She looked at Roderick sharply and with a little blush. "I listen to Mary," Roderick continued, "for the sake of her voice. It's distractingly sweet." At this Miss Garland's blush deepened, and she looked away. Rowland, in Florence, as we know, had suffered his imagination to wander in the direction of certain conjectures which the reader may deem unflattering to Miss Garland's constancy. He had asked himself whether her faith in Roderick had not faltered, and that demand of hers which had brought about his own departure for Switzerland had seemed almost equivalent to a confession that she needed his help to believe. Rowland was essentially a modest man, and he did not risk the supposition that Miss Garland had contrasted him with Roderick to his own advantage; but he had a certain consciousness of duty resolutely done, which allowed itself to fancy at moments that it might be not illogically rewarded by the bestowal of such stray grains of enthusiasm as had crumbled away from her estimate of his companion. If some day she had declared, in a sudden burst of passion, that she was outwearied and sickened, and that she gave up her recreant lover, Rowland's expectation would have gone halfway to meet her. And certainly, if her passion had taken this course, no generous critic would utterly condemn her. She had been neglected, ignored, forsaken, treated with a contempt which no girl of a fine temper could endure. There were girls, indeed, whose fineness, like that of Burd Helen in the ballad, lay in clinging to the man of their love through thick and thin, and in bowing their head to all hard usage. This attitude had often an exquisite beauty of its own, but Rowland deemed that he had solid reason to believe it could never be Mary Garland's. She was not a passive creature; she was not soft and meek and grateful for chance bounties. With all her reserve of manner, she was proud and eager; she asked much, and she wanted what she asked. She believed in fine things, and she never could long persuade herself that fine things missed were as beautiful as fine things achieved. Once Rowland passed an angry day. He had dreamed, it was the most insubstantial of dreams, that she had given him the right to believe that she looked to him to transmute her discontent. And yet here she was, throwing herself back into Roderick's arms at his lightest overture, and playing with his own half fearful, half shameful hopes. Rowland declared to himself that his position was essentially detestable, and that all the philosophy he could bring to bear upon it would make it neither honorable nor comfortable. He would go away and make an end of it. He did not go away; he simply took a long walk, stayed away from the inn all day, and on his return found Miss Garland sitting out in the moonlight with Roderick. Rowland, communing with himself during the restless ramble in question, had determined that he would at least cease to observe, to heed, or to care for what Miss Garland and Roderick might do or might not do together. Nevertheless, some 3 days afterward, the opportunity presenting itself, he deliberately broached the subject with Roderick. He knew this was inconsistent and faint-hearted; it was indulgence to the fingers that itched to handle forbidden fruit. But he said to himself that it was really more logical to be inconsistent than the reverse, for they had formerly discussed these mysteries very candidly. Was it not perfectly reasonable that he should wish to know the sequel of the situation which Roderick had then delineated? Roderick had made him promises, and it was to be expected that he should ascertain how the promises had been kept. Rowland could not say to himself that if the promises had been extorted for Mary Garland's sake, his present attention to them was equally disinterested, and so he had to admit that he was indeed faint-hearted. He may perhaps be deemed too narrow a casuist, but we have repeated more than once that he was solidly burdened with a conscience. "I imagine," he said to Roderick, "that you are not sorry at present to have allowed yourself to be dissuaded from making a final rupture with Miss Garland." Roderick eyed him with a vague and absent look which had lately become habitual to his face, and repeated, "Dissuaded?" "Don't you remember that in Rome you wished to break your engagement, and that I urged you to respect it, though it seemed to hang by so slender a thread? I wished you to see what would come of it. If I am not mistaken, you are reconciled to it." "Oh yes," said Roderick, "I remember what you said. You made it a kind of a personal favor to yourself that I should remain faithful. I consented, but afterwards, when I thought of it, your attitude greatly amused me. Had it ever been seen before, a man asking another man to gratify him by not suspending his attentions to a pretty girl?" "It was as selfish as anything else," said Rowland. "One man puts his selfishness into one thing, and one into another. It would have utterly marred my comfort to see Miss Garland in low spirits." "But you liked her, you admired her, eh? So you intimated." "I admire her profoundly." "It was your originality, then to do you justice you have a great deal of a certain sort to wish her happiness secured in just that fashion. Many a man would have liked better himself to make the woman he admired happy, and would have welcomed her low spirits as an opening for sympathy. You were awfully queer about it." "So be it," said Rowland. "The question is, are you not glad I was queer? Are you not finding that your affection for Miss Garland has a permanent quality which you rather underestimated?" "I don't pretend to say. When she arrived in Rome I found I didn't care for her, and I honestly proposed that we should have no humbug about it. If you, on the contrary, thought there was something to be gained by having a little humbug, I was willing to try it. I don't see that the situation is really changed. Mary Garland is all that she ever was more than all. But I don't care for her. I don't care for anything, and I don't find myself inspired to make an exception in her favor. The only difference is that I don't care now whether I care for her or not. Of course, marrying such a useless lout as I am is out of the question for any woman, and I should pay Miss Garland a poor compliment to assume that she is in a hurry to celebrate our nuptials." "Oh, you're in love," said Rowland, not very logically. It must be confessed at any cost that this assertion was made for the sole purpose of hearing Roderick deny it. But it quite failed of its aim. Roderick gave a liberal shrug of his shoulders and an irresponsible toss of his head. "Call it what you please. I am past caring for names." Rowland had not only been illogical, he had also been slightly disingenuous. He did not believe that his companion was in love. He had argued the false to learn the true. The true was that Roderick was again, in some degree, under a charm, and that he found a healing virtue in Mary's presence, indisposed though he was to admit it. He had said, shortly before, that her voice was sweet to his ear, and this was a promising beginning. If her voice was sweet, it was probable that her glance was not amiss, that her touch had a quiet magic, and that her whole personal presence had learned the art of not being irritating. So Rowland reasoned, and invested Mary Garland with a still finer loveliness. End of Chapter 12, Part A. Chapter 12, Part B, of Roderick Hudson, by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was true that she herself helped him little to definite conclusions, and that he remained in puzzled doubt as to whether these happy touches were still a matter of the heart, or had become simply a matter of the conscience. He watched for signs that she rejoiced in Roderick's renewed acceptance of her society, but it seemed to him that she was on her guard against interpreting it too largely. It was now her turn he fancied that he sometimes gathered from certain nameless indications of glance and tone and gesture it was now her turn to be indifferent, to care for other things. Again and again Rowland asked himself what these things were that Miss Garland might be supposed to care for, to the injury of ideal constancy; and again, having designated them, he divided them into two portions. One was that larger experience in general, which had come to her with her arrival in Europe, the vague sense, borne in upon her imagination, that there were more things one might do with one's life than youth and ignorance and Northampton had dreamt of, the revision of old pledges in the light of new emotions. The other was in the experience, in especial, of Rowland's what? Here Rowland always paused, in perfect sincerity, to measure afresh his possible claim to the young girl's regard. What might he call it? It had been more than civility, and yet it had been less than devotion. It had spoken of a desire to serve, but it had said nothing of a hope of reward. Nevertheless, Rowland's fancy hovered about the idea that it was recompensable, and his reflections ended in a reverie which perhaps did not define it, but at least on each occasion added a little to its volume. Since Miss Garland had asked him as a sort of favor to herself to come also to Switzerland, he thought it possible she might let him know whether he seemed to have effectively served her. The days passed without her doing so, and at last Rowland walked away to an isolated eminence some 5 miles from the inn, and murmured to the silent rocks that she was ungrateful. Listening nature seemed not to contradict him, so that, on the morrow, he asked the young girl, with an infinitesimal touch of irony, whether it struck her that his deflection from his Florentine plan had been attended with brilliant results. "Why, we are delighted that you are here with us," she answered. He was anything but satisfied with this. It seemed to imply that she had forgotten that she had solemnly asked him to come. He reminded her of her request, and recalled the place and time. That evening on the terrace, late, after Mrs. Hudson had gone to bed, and Roderick being absent. She perfectly remembered, but the memory seemed to trouble her. "I am afraid your kindness has been a great charge upon you," she said. "You wanted very much to do something else." "I wanted above all things to oblige you, and I made no sacrifice. But if I had made an immense one, it would be more than made up to me by any assurance that I have helped Roderick into a better mood." She was silent a moment, and then, "Why do you ask me?" she said. "You are able to judge quite as well as I." Rowland blushed; he desired to justify himself in the most veracious manner. "The truth is," he said, "that I am afraid I care only in the second place for Roderick's holding up his head. What I care for in the first place is your happiness." "I don't know why that should be," she answered. "I have certainly done nothing to make you so much my friend. If you were to tell me you intended to leave us to morrow, I am afraid I should not venture to ask you to stay. But whether you go or stay, let us not talk of Roderick." "But that," said Rowland, "does n't answer my question. Is he better?" "No," she said, and turned away. He was careful not to tell her that he intended to leave them. One day, shortly after this, as the two young men sat at the inn door watching the sunset, which on that evening was very striking and lurid, Rowland made an attempt to sound his companion's present sentiment touching Christina Light. "I wonder where she is," he said, "and what sort of a life she is leading her prince." Roderick at first made no response. He was watching a figure on the summit of some distant rocks opposite to them. The figure was apparently descending into the valley, and in relief against the crimson screen of the western sky it looked gigantic. "Christina Light?" Roderick at last repeated, as if arousing himself from a reverie. "Where she is? It 's extraordinary how little I care." "Have you then completely got over it?" To this Roderick made no direct reply. He sat brooding a while. "She 's a humbug!" he presently exclaimed. "Possibly," said Rowland. "But I have known worse ones." "She disappointed me," Roderick continued in the same tone. Had she, then, really given you hopes?" "Oh, don't recall it!" Roderick cried. "Why the devil should I think of it? It was only 3 months ago, but it seems like 10 years." His friend said nothing more, and after a while he went on of his own accord. "I believed there was a future in it all. She pleased me, pleased me. And when an artist, such as I was, is pleased, you know" and he paused again. "You never saw her as I did, you never heard her in her great moments. But there is no use talking about that. At first she wouldn't regard me seriously; she chaffed me and made light of me. But at last I forced her to admit I was a great man. Think of that, sir! Christina Light called me a great man. A great man was what she was looking for, and we agreed to find our happiness for life in each other. To please me, she promised not to marry till I gave her leave. I was not in a marrying way myself, but it was damnation to think of another man possessing her. To spare my sensibilities, she promised to turn off her prints, and the idea of her doing so made me as happy as to see a perfect statue shaping itself in the block. You have seen how she kept her promise. When I learned it, it was as if the statue had suddenly cracked and turned hideous. She died for me, like that," and he snapped his fingers. "Was it wounded vanity, disappointed desire, betrayed confidence? I'm sure I don't know. You certainly have some name for it." "The poor girl did the best she could," said Rowland. "If that was her best, so much the worse for her. I have hardly thought of her these 2 months, but I have not forgiven her." "Well, you may believe that you are avenged. I can't think of her as happy." "I don't pity her," said Roderick. Then he relapsed into silence, and the two sat watching the colossal figure as it made its way downward along the jagged silhouette of the rocks. "Who is this mighty man?" cried Roderick at last. "And what is he coming down upon us for? We are small people here, and we can't undertake to keep company with giants." "Wait till we meet him on our own level," said Rowland, "and perhaps he will not overtop us." "For 10 minutes, at least," Roderick rejoined, "he will have been a great man." At this moment the figure sank beneath the horizon line and became invisible in the uncertain light. Suddenly Roderick said, "I would like to see her once more, simply to look at her." "I would not advise it," said Rowland. "It was her beauty that did it," Roderick went on. "It was all her beauty. In comparison, the rest was nothing. What befooled me was to think of it as my property. And I had made it mine. No one else had studied it as I had. No one else understood it. What does that stick of a Casamassima know about it at this hour? I should like to see it just once more. It's the only thing in the world of which I can say so." "I would not advise it," Rowland repeated. "That's right, dear Rowland," said Roderick. "Don't advise. That's no use now." The dusk, meanwhile, had thickened, and they had not perceived a figure approaching them across the open space in front of the house. Suddenly it stepped into the circle of light projected from the door and windows, and they beheld little Sam Singleton stopping to stare at them. He was the giant whom they had seen descending along the rocks. When this was made apparent, Roderick was seized with a fit of intense hilarity. It was the first time he had laughed in 3 months. Singleton, who carried a knapsack and walking staff, received from Rowland the friendliest welcome. He was in the serenest possible humor, and if in the way of luggage his knapsack contained nothing but a comb and a second shirt, he produced from it a dozen admirable sketches. He had been trudging over half Switzerland, and making everywhere the most vivid pictorial notes. They were mostly in a box at Interlaken, and in gratitude for Rowland's appreciation he presently telegraphed for his box, which, according to the excellent Swiss method, was punctually delivered by post. The nights were cold, and our friends, with 3 or 4 other chance sojourners, sat indoors over a fire of logs. Even with Roderick sitting moodily in the outer shadow, they made a sympathetic little circle, and they turned over Singleton's drawings, while he perched in the chimney corner, blushing and grinning, with his feet on the rounds of his chair. He had been pedestrianizing for 6 weeks, and he was glad to rest a while at Engelthal. It was an economic repose, however, for he sallied forth every morning with his sketching tools on his back in search of material for new studies. Roderick's hilarity, after the first evening, had subsided, and he watched the little painter's serene activity with a gravity that was almost portentous. Singleton, who was not in the secret of his personal misfortunes, still treated him with timid frankness as the rising star of American art. Roderick had said to Rowland at first that Singleton reminded him of some curious little insect with a remarkable mechanical instinct in its antennae; but as the days went by it was apparent that the modest landscapist's unflagging industry grew to have an oppressive meaning for him. It pointed a moral, and Roderick used to sit and con the moral as he saw it figured in Singleton's bent back, on the hot hillsides, protruding from beneath his white umbrella. One day he wandered up a long slope and overtook him as he sat at work. Singleton related the incident afterwards to Rowland, who, after giving him in Rome a hint of Roderick's aberrations, had strictly kept his own counsel. "Are you always like this?" said Roderick in almost sepulchral accents. "Like this?" repeated Singleton, blinking confusedly, with an alarmed conscience. "You remind me of a watch that never runs down. If one listens hard one hears you always tick tick, tick tick." "Oh, I see," said Singleton, beaming ingenuously. "I am very equable." "You are very equable, yes. And do you find it pleasant to be equable?" Singleton turned and grinned more brightly while he sucked the water from his camel's hair brush. Then, with a quickened sense of his indebtedness to a Providence that had endowed him with intrinsic facilities, "Oh, delightful!" he exclaimed. Roderick stood looking at him a moment. "Damnation!" he said at last, solemnly, and turned his back. One morning, shortly after this, Rowland and Roderick took a long walk. They had walked before in a dozen different directions, but they had not yet crossed a charming little wooded pass which shut in their valley on one side and descended into the vale of Engelberg. In coming from Lucerne they had approached their inn by this path, and feeling that they knew it, had hitherto neglected it in favor of untrodden ways. But at last the list of these was exhausted, and Rowland proposed a walk to Engelberg as a novelty. The place is half bleak and half pastoral. A huge white monastery rises abruptly from the green floor of the valley, and complicates its picturesqueness with an element rare in Swiss scenery. Hard by is a group of chalets and inns, with the usual appurtenances of a prosperous Swiss resort: lean brown guides in baggy homespun, lounging under carved wooden galleries, stacks of alpenstocks in every doorway, sun-scorched Englishmen without shirt collars. Our two friends sat a while at the door of an inn, discussing a pint of wine, and then Roderick, who was indefatigable, announced his intention of climbing to a certain rocky pinnacle which overhung the valley, and according to the testimony of one of the guides, commanded a view of the Lake of Lucerne. To go and come back was only a matter of an hour, but Rowland, with the prospect of his homeward trudge before him, confessed to a preference for lounging on his bench, or at most strolling a trifle farther and taking a look at the monastery. Roderick went off alone, and his companion after a while bent his steps to the monasterial church. It was remarkable, like most of the churches of Catholic Switzerland, for a hideous style of devotional ornament, but it had a certain cold and musty picturesqueness, and Rowland lingered there with some tenderness for Alpine piety. While he was near the high altar some people came in at the west door, but he did not notice them, and was presently engaged in deciphering a curious old German epitaph on one of the mural tablets. At last he turned away, wondering whether its syntax or its theology was the more uncomfortable, and, to this infinite surprise, found himself confronted with the Prince and Princess Casamassima. The surprise on Christina's part, for an instant, was equal, and at first she seemed disposed to turn away without letting it give place to a greeting. The prince, however, saluted gravely, and then Christina in silence put out her hand. Rowland immediately asked whether they were staying at Engelberg, but Christina only looked at him without speaking. The prince answered his questions, and related that they had been making a month's tour in Switzerland, that at Lucerne his wife had been somewhat obstinately indisposed, and that the physician had recommended a week's trial of the tonic air and goat's milk of Engelberg. The scenery, said the prince, was stupendous, but the life was terribly sad, and they had 3 days more. It was a blessing, he urbanely added, to see a good Roman face. Christina's attitude, her solemn silence, and her penetrating gaze seemed to Rowland at first to savour of affectation, but he presently perceived that she was profoundly agitated, and that she was afraid of betraying herself. "Do let us leave this hideous edifice," she said. "There are things here that set one's teeth on edge." They moved slowly to the door, and when they stood outside, in the sunny coolness of the valley, she turned to Rowland and said, "I am extremely glad to see you." Then she glanced about her and observed against the wall of the church an old stone seat. She looked at Prince Casamassima a moment, and he smiled more intensely, Rowland thought, than the occasion demanded. "I wish to sit here," she said, "and speak to Mr. Mallet alone." "At your pleasure, dear friend," said the prince. The tone of each was measured to Rowland's ear, but that of Christina was dry, and that of her husband was splendidly urbane. Rowland remembered that the Cavaliere Giacosa had told him that Mrs. Light's candidate was thoroughly a prince, and our friend wondered how he relished a peremptory accent. Casamassima was an Italian of the undemonstrative type, but Rowland nevertheless divined that, like other princes before him, he had made the acquaintance of the thing called compromise. "Shall I come back?" he asked with the same smile. "In half an hour," said Christina. In the clear outer light, Rowland's first impression of her was that she was more beautiful than ever. And yet in 3 months she could hardly have changed. The change was in Rowland's own vision of her, which that last interview, on the eve of her marriage, had made unprecedentedly tender. "How came you here?" she asked. "Are you staying in this place?" "I am staying at Engelthal, some 10 miles away. I walked over." "Are you alone?" "I am with Mr. Hudson." "Is he here with you?" "He went half an hour ago to climb a rock for a view." "And his mother and that young girl, where are they?" "They are also at Engelthal." "What do you do there?" "What do you do here?" said Rowland, smiling. "I count the minutes till my week is up. I hate mountains. They depress me to death. I am sure Miss Garland likes them." "She is very fond of them, I believe." "You believe? Don't you know? But I have given up trying to imitate Miss Garland," said Christina. "You surely need imitate no one." "Don't say that," she said gravely. "So you have walked 10 miles this morning, and you are to walk back again?" "Back again to supper." "And Mr. Hudson too?" "Mr. Hudson especially. He is a great walker." "You men are happy!" Christina cried. "I believe I should enjoy the mountains if I could do such things. It is sitting still and having them scowl down at you. Prince Casamassima never rides; he only goes on a mule. He was carried up the Faulhorn on a litter." "On a litter?" said Rowland. "In one of those machines a chaise à porteur, like a woman." Rowland received this information in silence. It was equally unbecoming to either relish or deprecate its irony. "Is Mr. Hudson to join you again? Will he come here?" Christina asked. "I shall soon begin to expect him." "What shall you do when you leave Switzerland?" Christina continued. "Shall you go back to Rome?" "I rather doubt it. My plans are very uncertain." "They depend upon Mr. Hudson, eh?" "In a great measure." "I want you to tell me about him. Is he still in that perverse state of mind that afflicted you so much?" Rowland looked at her mistrustfully, without answering. He was indisposed, instinctively, to tell her that Roderick was unhappy. It was possible she might offer to help him back to happiness. She immediately perceived his hesitation. "I see no reason why we should not be frank," she said. "I should think we were excellently placed for that sort of thing. You remember that formerly I cared very little what I said, don't you? Well, I care absolutely not at all now. I say what I please, I do what I please. How did Mr. Hudson receive the news of my marriage?" "Very badly," said Rowland. "With rage and reproaches?" And as Rowland hesitated again, With silent contempt? I can tell you but little. He spoke to me on the subject, but I stopped him. I told him it was none of his business or of mine." "That was an excellent answer," said Christina, softly. "Yet it was a little your business, after those sublime protestations I treated you to. I was really very fine that morning, eh?" "You do yourself injustice," said Rowland. "I should be at liberty now to believe you were insincere." "What does it matter now whether I was insincere or not? I can't conceive of anything mattering less. I was very fine; isn't it true?" "You know what I think of you," said Rowland. And for fear of being forced to betray his suspicion of the cause of her change, he took refuge in a commonplace. "Your mother, I hope, is well?" "My mother is in the enjoyment of superb health, and may be seen every evening at the Casino, at the baths of Lucca, confiding to every newcomer that she has married her daughter to a pearl of a prince." Rowland was anxious for news of Mrs. Light's companion, and the natural course was frankly to inquire about him. "And the Cavaliere Giacosa is well?" he asked. Christina hesitated, but she betrayed no other embarrassment. "The Cavaliere has retired to his native city of Ancona upon a pension for the rest of his natural life. He is a very good old man." "I have a great regard for him," said Rowland, gravely, at the same time that he privately wondered whether the Cavaliere's pension was paid by Prince Casamassima for services rendered in connection with his marriage. Had the Cavaliere received his commission? "And what do you do," Rowland continued, "on leaving this place?" "We go to Italy; we go to Naples." She rose and stood silent a moment, looking down the valley. The figure of Prince Casamassima appeared in the distance, balancing his white umbrella. As her eyes rested upon it, Rowland imagined that he saw something deeper in the strange expression which had lurked in her face while he talked to her. At first he had been dazzled by her blooming beauty, to which the lapse of weeks had only added splendor. Then he had seen a heavier ray in the light of her eye, a sinister intimation of sadness and bitterness. It was the outward mark of her sacrificed ideal. Her eyes grew cold as she looked at her husband, and when, after a moment, she turned them upon Rowland, they struck him as intensely tragical. He felt a singular mixture of sympathy and dread. He wished to give her a proof of friendship, and yet it seemed to him that she had now turned her face in a direction where friendship was impotent to interpose. She half read his feelings, apparently, and she gave a beautiful, sad smile. "I hope we may never meet again," she said. And as Rowland gave her a protesting look, "You have seen me at my best. I wish to tell you solemnly I was sincere. I know appearances are against me," she went on quickly. "There is a great deal I can't tell you. Perhaps you have guessed it. I care very little. You know, at any rate, I did my best. It wouldn't serve. I was beaten and broken. They were stronger than I. Now it's another affair." "It seems to me you have a large chance for happiness yet," said Rowland vaguely. "Happiness? I mean to cultivate rapture. I mean to go for bliss ineffable. You remember I told you that I was in part the world's and the devil's. Now they have taken me all. It was their choice. May they never repent." "I shall hear of you," said Rowland. "You will hear of me, and whatever you do hear, remember this: I was sincere." Prince Casamassima had approached, and Rowland looked at him with a good deal of simple compassion as a part of that "world" against which Christina had launched her mysterious menace. It was obvious that he was a good fellow, and that he could not, in the nature of things, be a positively bad husband, but his distinguished inoffensiveness only deepened the infelicity of Christina's situation by depriving her defiant attitude of the sanction of relative justice. So long as she had been free to choose, she had esteemed him, but from the moment she was forced to marry him, she had detested him. Rowland read in the young man's elastic Italian mask a profound consciousness of all this, and as he found there also a record of other curious things, of pride, of temper, of bigotry, of an immense heritage of more or less aggressive traditions, he reflected that the matrimonial conjunction of his two companions might be sufficiently prolific in incident. "You are going to Naples?" Rowland said to the prince by way of conversation. "We are going to Paris," Christina interposed, slowly and softly. "We are going to London. We are going to Vienna. We are going to St. Petersburg." Prince Casamassima dropped his eyes and fretted the earth with the point of his umbrella. While he engaged Rowland's attention, Christina turned away. When Rowland glanced at her again, he saw a change pass over her face. She was observing something that was concealed from his own eyes by the angle of the church wall. In a moment Roderick stepped into sight. He stopped short, astonished. His face and figure were jaded, his garments dusty. He looked at Christina from head to foot, and then slowly his cheek flushed and his eye expanded. Christina returned his gaze, and for some moments there was a singular silence. "You don't look well," Christina said at last. Roderick answered nothing; he only looked and looked, as if she had been a statue. "You are no less beautiful!" he presently cried. She turned away with a smile, and stood a while gazing down the valley. Roderick stared at Prince Casamassima. Christina then put out her hand to Rowland. "Farewell," she said. "If you are near me in the future, don't try to see me." And then, after a pause, in a lower tone, "I was sincere." She addressed herself again to Roderick, and asked him some commonplace about his walk, but he said nothing, he only looked at her. Rowland at first had expected an outbreak of reproach, but it was evident that the danger was every moment diminishing. He was forgetting everything but her beauty, and as she stood there and let him feast upon it, Rowland was sure that she knew it. "I won't say farewell to you," she said. "We shall meet again." And she moved gravely away. Prince Casamassima took leave courteously of Rowland. Upon Roderick he bestowed a bow of exaggerated civility. Roderick appeared not to see it. He was still watching Christina as she passed over the grass. His eyes followed her until she reached the door of her inn. Here she stopped and looked back at him. End of Chapter 12, Part B. Chapter 13 of Roderick Hudson by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13 Switzerland. On the homeward walk that evening, Roderick preserved a silence which Rowland allowed to make him uneasy. Early on the morrow, Roderick, saying nothing of his intentions, started off on a walk. Rowland saw him striding with light steps along the rugged path to Engelberg. He was absent all day, and he gave no account of himself on his return. He said that he was deadly tired, and he went to bed early. When he had left the room, Miss Garland drew near to Rowland. "I wish to ask you a question," she said. "What happened to Roderick yesterday at Engelberg?" "You have discovered that something happened?" Rowland answered. "I am sure of it. Was it something painful?" "I don't know how, at the present moment, he judges it. He met the Princess Casamassima." "Thank you," said Miss Garland simply, and turned away. The conversation had been brief, but like many small things, it furnished Rowland with food for reflection. When one is looking for symptoms, one easily finds them. This was the first time Mary Garland had asked Rowland a question which it was in Roderick's power to answer, the first time she had frankly betrayed Roderick's reticence. Rowland ventured to think it marked an era. The next morning was sultry, and the air, usually so fresh at those altitudes, was oppressively heavy. Rowland lounged on the grass a while near Singleton, who was at work under his white umbrella within view of the house, and then in quest of coolness he wandered away to the rocky ridge whence you looked across at the Jungfrau. To day, however, the white summits were invisible, their heads were muffled in sullen clouds, and the valleys beneath them curtained in dun-coloured mist. Rowland had a book in his pocket, and he took it out and opened it. But his page remained unturned; his own thoughts were more importunate. His interview with Christina Light had made a great impression upon him, and he was haunted with the memory of her almost blameless bitterness, and of all that was tragic and fatal in her latest transformation. These things were immensely appealing, and Rowland thought with infinite impatience of Roderick's having again encountered them. It required little imagination to apprehend that the young sculptor's condition had also appealed to Christina. His consummate indifference, his supreme defiance, would make him a magnificent trophy, and Christina had announced with sufficient distinctness that she had said good-bye to scruples. It was her fancy at present to treat the world as a garden of pleasure, and if hitherto she had played with Roderick's passion on its stem, there was little doubt that now she would pluck it with an unfaltering hand and drain it of its acrid sweetness. And why the deuce need Roderick have gone marching back to destruction? Rowland's meditations, even when they began in rancour, often brought him peace, but on this occasion they ushered in a quite peculiar quality of unrest. He felt conscious of a sudden collapse in his moral energy. A current that had been flowing for 2 years with liquid strength seemed at last to pause and evaporate. Rowland looked away at the stagnant vapours on the mountains. Their dreariness seemed a symbol of the dreariness which his own generosity had bequeathed him. At last he had arrived at the uttermost limit of the deference a sane man might pay to other people's folly. Nay, rather he had transgressed it. He had been befooled on a gigantic scale. He turned to his book and tried to woo back patience, but it gave him cold comfort and he tossed it angrily away. He pulled his hat over his eyes and tried to wonder dispassionately whether atmospheric conditions had not something to do with his ill humour. He remained for some time in this attitude, but was finally aroused from it by a singular sense that although he had heard nothing, some one had approached him. He looked up and saw Roderick standing before him on the turf. His mood made the spectacle unwelcome, and for a moment he felt like uttering an uncivil speech. Roderick stood looking at him with an expression of countenance which had of late become rare. There was an unfamiliar spark in his eye, and a certain imperious alertness in his carriage. Confirmed habit, with Rowland, came speedily to the front. "What is it now?" he asked himself, and invited Roderick to sit down. Roderick had evidently something particular to say, and if he remained silent for a time it was not because he was ashamed of it. "I would like you to do me a favor," he said at last. "Lend me some money." "How much do you wish?" Rowland asked. "Say 1,000 francs." Rowland hesitated a moment. "I don't wish to be indiscreet, but may I ask what you propose to do with 1,000 francs?" "To go to Interlaken." "And why are you going to Interlaken?" Roderick replied without a shadow of wavering, "Because that woman is to be there." Rowland burst out laughing, but Roderick remained serenely grave. "You have forgiven her, then?" said Rowland. "Not a bit of it." "I don't understand." "Neither do I. I only know that she is incomparably beautiful, and that she has waked me up amazingly. Besides, she asked me to come." "She asked you?" "Yesterday, in so many words." "Ah, the jade!" "Exactly. I am willing to take her for that." "Why in the name of common sense did you go back to her?" "Why did I find her standing there like a goddess who has just stepped out of her cloud? Why did I look at her? Before I knew where I was, the harm was done." Rowland, who had been sitting erect, threw himself back on the grass and lay for some time staring up at the sky. At last, raising himself, "Are you perfectly serious?" he asked. "Deadly serious." "Your idea is to remain at Interlaken for some time?" "Indefinitely," said Roderick; and it seemed to his companion that the tone in which he said this made it immensely well worth hearing. "And your mother and cousin meanwhile are to remain here? It will soon be getting very cold, you know." "It doesn't seem much like it to day." "Very true; but to day is a day by itself." "There is nothing to prevent their going back to Lucerne. I depend upon your taking charge of them." At this Rowland reclined upon the grass again, and again, after reflection, he faced his friend. "How would you express," he asked, "the character of the profit that you expect to derive from your excursion?" "I see no need of expressing it. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. The case is simply this. I desire immensely to be near Christina Light, and it is such a huge refreshment to find myself again desiring something that I propose to drift with the current. As I say, she has waked me up, and it is possible something may come of it. She makes me feel as if I were alive again. This," and he glanced down at the inn, "I call death." "That I am very grateful to hear. You really feel as if you might do something?" "Don't ask too much. I only know that she makes my heart beat, makes me see visions." "You feel encouraged?" "I feel excited." "You are really looking better." "I am glad to hear it. Now that I have answered your questions, please to give me the money." Rowland shook his head. "For that purpose I can't." "You can't?" "It's impossible. Your plan is rank folly. I can't help you in it." Rowland flushed a little and his eye expanded. "I will borrow what money I can, then, from Mary." This was not viciously said; it had simply the ring of passionate resolution. Instantly it brought Rowland to terms. He took a bunch of keys from his pocket and tossed it upon the grass. "The little brass one opens my dressing case," he said. "You will find money in it." Roderick let the keys lie. Something seemed to have struck him. He looked askance at his friend. "You are awfully gallant." "You certainly are not. Your proposal is an outrage." "Very likely. It 's a proof the more of my desire." "If you have so much steam on, then, use it for something else. You say you are awake again? I 'm delighted, only be so in the best sense. Isn't it very plain? If you have the energy to desire, you have also the energy to reason and to judge. If you can care to go, you can also care to stay; and staying being the more profitable course, the inspiration, on that side, for a man who has his self confidence to win back again, should be greater." Roderick plainly did not relish this simple logic, and his eye grew angry as he listened to its echo. "Oh, the devil!" he cried. Rowland went on. "Do you believe that hanging about Christina Light will do you any good? Do you believe it won't? In either case you should keep away from her. If it won't, it 's your duty, and if it will, you can get on without it." "Do me good!" cried Roderick. "What do I want of good? What should I do with good? I want what she gives me, call it by what name you will. I want to ask no questions, but to take what comes, and let it fill the impossible hours. But I did n't come to discuss the matter." "I have not the least desire to discuss it," said Rowland. "I simply protest." Roderick meditated a moment. "I have never yet thought twice of accepting a favor of you," he said at last, "but this one sticks in my throat." "It is not a favor. I lend you the money only under compulsion." "Well, then, I will take it only under compulsion!" Roderick exclaimed; and he sprang up abruptly and marched away. His words were ambiguous. Rowland lay on the grass wondering what they meant. Half an hour had not elapsed before Roderick reappeared, heated with rapid walking, and wiping his forehead. He flung himself down and looked at his friend with an eye which expressed something purer than bravado, and yet baser than conviction. "I have done my best," he said. "My mother is out of money. She is expecting next week some circular notes from London. She had only 10 francs in her pocket. Mary Garland gave me every sou she possessed in the world. It makes exactly 34 francs. That 's not enough." "You asked Miss Garland?" cried Rowland. "I asked her." "And told her your purpose?" "I named no names, but she knew." "What did she say?" "Not a syllable. She simply emptied her purse." Rowland turned over and buried his face in his arms. He felt a movement of irrepressible elation, and he barely stifled a cry of joy. Now, surely, Roderick had shattered the last link in the chain that bound Mary to him, and after this she would be free. When he turned about again, Roderick was still sitting there, and he had not touched the keys which lay on the grass. "I don't know what 's the matter with me," said Roderick, "but I have an insurmountable aversion to taking your money." "The matter, I suppose, is that you have a grain of wisdom left." "No, it 's not that. It 's a kind of brute instinct. I find it extremely provoking." He sat there for some time with his head in his hands and his eyes on the ground. His lips were compressed, and he was evidently, in fact, in a state of profound irritation. "You have succeeded in making this thing excessively unpleasant!" he exclaimed. "I am sorry," said Rowland, "but I can't see it in any other way." "That I believe, and I resent the range of your vision pretending to be the limit of my action. You can't feel for me, nor judge for me, and there are certain things you know nothing about. I have suffered, sir," Roderick went on with increasing emphasis. "I have suffered damnable torments. Have I been such a placid, contented, comfortable man this last 6 months, that when I find a chance to forget my misery I should take such pains not to profit by it? You ask too much for a man who himself has no occasion to play the hero. I don't say that invidiously; it's your disposition, and you can't help it. But decidedly there are certain things you know nothing about." Rowland listened to this outbreak with open eyes, and Roderick, if he had been less intent upon his own eloquence, would probably have perceived that he turned pale. "These things, what are they?" Rowland asked. "They are women, principally, and what relates to women. Women for you, by what I can make out, mean nothing. You have no imagination, no sensibility." "That's a serious charge," said Rowland gravely. "I don't make it without proof." "And what is your proof?" Roderick hesitated a moment. "The way you treated Christina Light, I call that grossly obtuse." "Obtuse?" Rowland repeated, frowning. "Thick-skinned, beneath your good fortune." "My good fortune?" "There it is; it's all news to you. You had pleased her. I don't say she was dying of love for you, but she took a fancy to you." "We will let this pass," said Rowland after a silence. "Oh, I don't insist. I have only her own word for it." "She told you this?" "You noticed at least, I suppose, that she was not afraid to speak. I never repeated it, not because I was jealous, but because I was curious to see how long your ignorance would last if left to itself." "I frankly confess it would have lasted forever. And yet I don't consider that my insensibility is proved." "Oh, don't say that!" cried Roderick, "or I shall begin to suspect what I must do you the justice to say that I have never suspected that you are a trifle conceited. Upon my word, when I think of all this, your protest, as you call it, against my following Christina Light seems to me thoroughly offensive. There is something monstrous in a man's pretending to lay down the law to a sort of emotion with which he is quite unacquainted, and his asking a fellow to give up a lovely woman for conscience' sake, when he has never had the impulse to strike a blow for one for passion's." "Oh, oh!" cried Rowland. "Well, that's very easy to say," Roderick went on, "but you must remember that there are such things as nerves and senses and imagination, and a restless demon within that may sleep sometimes for a day or for 6 months, but that sooner or later wakes up and thumps at your ribs till you listen to him. If you can't understand that, take it on trust, and let a poor imaginative devil live his life as he can." Roderick's words seemed at first to Rowland like something heard in a dream. It was impossible they had been actually spoken, so supreme an expression were they of the insolence of egotism. Reality was never so consistent as that. But Roderick sat there, balancing his beautiful head, and the echoes of his strident accents still lingered along the half muffled mountain side. Rowland suddenly felt that the cup of his chagrin was full to overflowing, and his long gathered bitterness surged into the simple, wholesome passion of anger for wasted kindness. But he spoke without violence, and Roderick was probably at first far from measuring the force that lay beneath his words. "You are incredibly ungrateful," he said. "You are talking arrogant nonsense. What do you know about my sensibilities and my imagination? How do you know whether I have loved or suffered? If I have held my tongue and not troubled you with my complaints, you find it the most natural thing in the world to put an ignoble construction on my silence. I loved quite as well as you; indeed, I think I may say rather better. I have been constant. I have been willing to give more than I received. I have not forsaken one mistress because I thought another more beautiful, nor given up the other and believed all manner of evil about her because I had not my way with her. I have been a good friend to Christina Light, and it seems to me my friendship does her quite as much honor as your love." "Your love, your suffering, your silence, your friendship!" cried Roderick. "I declare I don't understand." "I dare say not. You are not used to understanding such things. You are not used to hearing me talk of my feelings. You are altogether too much taken up with your own. Be as much so as you please. I have always respected your right. Only when I have kept myself in durance on purpose to leave you an open field, don't, by way of thanking me, come and call me an idiot." "Oh, you claim then that you have made sacrifices?" "Several. You have never suspected it?" "If I had, do you suppose I would have allowed it?" cried Roderick. "They were the sacrifices of friendship, and they were easily made, only I don't enjoy having them thrown back in my teeth." This was, under the circumstances, a sufficiently generous speech, but Roderick was not in the humour to take it generously. "Come, be more definite," he said. "Let me know where it is the shoe has pinched." Rowland frowned. If Roderick would not take generosity, he should have full justice. "It's a perpetual sacrifice," he said, "to live with a perfect egotist." "I am an egotist?" cried Roderick. "Did it never occur to you?" "An egotist to whom you have made perpetual sacrifices?" He repeated the words in a singular tone, a tone that denoted neither exactly indignation nor incredulity, but, strange as it may seem, a sudden violent curiosity for news about himself. "You are selfish," said Rowland. "You think only of yourself and believe only in yourself. You regard other people only as they play into your own hands. You have always been very frank about it, and the thing seemed so mixed up with the temper of your genius and the very structure of your mind that often one was willing to take the evil with the good, and to be thankful that, considering your great talent, you were no worse. But if one believed in you, as I have done, one paid a tax upon it." Roderick leaned his elbows on his knees, clasped his hands together, and crossed them, shadewise, over his eyes. In this attitude, for a moment, he sat looking coldly at his friend. "So I have made you very uncomfortable?" he went on. "Extremely so." "I have been eager, grasping, obstinate, vain, ungrateful, indifferent, cruel?" "I have accused you mentally of all these things, with the exception of vanity." "You have often hated me?" "Never. I should have parted company with you before coming to that." "But you have wanted to part company, to bid me go my way and be hanged." "Repeatedly. Then I have had patience and forgiven you." "Forgiven me, eh? Suffering all the while?" "Yes, you may call it suffering." "Why did you never tell me all this before?" "Because my affection was always stronger than my resentment, because I preferred to err on the side of kindness, because I had myself, in a measure, launched you in the world and thrown you into temptations, and because nothing short of your unwarrantable aggression just now could have made me say these painful things." Roderick picked up a blade of long grass and began to bite it. Rowland was puzzled by his expression and manner. They seemed strangely cynical. There was something revolting in his deepening calmness. "I must have been hideous," Roderick presently resumed. "I am not talking for your entertainment," said Rowland. "Of course not; for my edification." As Roderick said these words there was not a ray of warmth in his brilliant eye. "I have spoken for my own relief," Rowland went on, "and so that you need never again go utterly astray as you have done this morning." "It has been a terrible mistake, then?" What his tone expressed was not wilful mockery, but a kind of persistent irresponsibility which Rowland found equally exasperating. He answered nothing. "And all this time," Roderick continued, "you have been in love? Tell me the woman." Rowland felt an immense desire to give him a visible, palpable pang. "Her name is Mary Garland," he said. Apparently he succeeded. The surprise was great. Roderick colored as he had never done. "Mary Garland! Heaven forgive us!" Rowland observed the "us." Roderick threw himself back on the turf. The latter lay for some time staring at the sky. At last he sprang to his feet, and Rowland rose also, rejoicing keenly, it must be confessed, in his companion's confusion. "For how long has this been?" Roderick demanded. "Since I first knew her." 2 years! And you have never told her?" "Never." "You have told no one?" "You are the first person." "Why have you been silent?" "Because of your engagement." "But you have done your best to keep that up." "That 's another matter." "It's very strange," said Roderick presently. "It's like something in a novel." "We needn't expatiate on it," said Rowland. "All I wish to do was to rebut your charge that I am an abnormal being." But still Roderick pondered. "All these months, while I was going on! I wish you had mentioned it." "I acted as was necessary, and that's the end of it." "You have a very high opinion of her?" "The highest." "I remember now your occasionally expressing it and my being struck with it. But I never dreamed you were in love with her. It's a pity she doesn't care for you." Rowland had made his point, and he had no wish to prolong the conversation; but he had a desire to hear more of this, and he remained silent. "You hope, I suppose, that some day she may?" "I shouldn't have offered to say so, but since you ask me, I do." "I don't believe it. She idolizes me, and if she were never to see me again, she would idolize my memory." This might be profound insight, and it might be profound fatuity. Rowland turned away; he could not trust himself to speak. "My indifference, my neglect of her must have seemed to you horrible. Altogether I must have appeared simply hideous." "Do you really care," Rowland asked, "what you appeared?" "Certainly. I have been damnably stupid. Isn't an artist supposed to be a man of perceptions? I am hugely disgusted." "Well, you understand now, and we can start afresh." "And yet," said Roderick, "though you have suffered in a degree, I don't believe you have suffered so much as some other men would have done." "Very likely not. In such matters quantitative analysis is difficult." Roderick picked up his stick and stood looking at the ground. "Nevertheless, I must have seemed hideous," he repeated. "Hideous." He turned away scowling, and Rowland offered no contradiction. They were both silent for some time, and at last Roderick gave a heavy sigh and began to walk away. "Where are you going?" Rowland then asked. "Oh, I don't care to walk. You have given me something to think of." This seemed a salutary impulse, and yet Rowland felt a nameless perplexity. "To have been so stupid damns me more than anything," Roderick went on. "Certainly I can shut up shop now." Rowland felt in no smiling humor, and yet in spite of himself he could almost have smiled at the very consistency of the fellow. It was egotism still, aesthetic disgust at the graceless contour of his conduct, but never a hint of simple sorrow for the pain he had given. Rowland let him go, and for some moments stood watching him. Suddenly Mallet became conscious of a singular and most illogical impulse, a desire to stop him, to have another word with him, not to lose sight of him. He called him, and Roderick turned. "I should like to go with you," said Rowland. "I am fit only to be alone. I am damned." "You had better not think of it at all," Rowland cried, "than think in that way." "There is only one way. I have been hideous." And he broke off and marched away with his long elastic steps, swinging his stick. Rowland watched him, and at the end of a moment called to him. Roderick stopped and looked at him in silence, and then abruptly turned and disappeared below the crest of a hill. Rowland passed the remainder of the day uncomfortably. He was half irritated, half depressed; he had an insufferable feeling of having been placed in the wrong in spite of his excellent cause. Roderick did not come home to dinner, but of this, with his passion for brooding away the hours on far off mountain sides, he had almost made a habit. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the noonday repast with a face which showed that Roderick's demand for money had unsealed the fountains of her distress. Little Singleton consumed an enormous and well earned dinner. Miss Garland, Rowland observed, had not contributed her scanty assistance to her kinsman's pursuit of the Princess Casamassima without an effort. The effort was visible in her pale face and her silence. She looked so ill that when they left the table Rowland felt almost bound to remark upon it. They had come out upon the grass in front of the inn. "I have a headache," she said. And then suddenly, looking about at the menacing sky and motionless air, "It's this horrible day." Rowland, that afternoon, tried to write a letter to his cousin Cecilia, but his head and his heart were alike heavy, and he traced upon the paper but a single line. "I believe there is such a thing as being too reasonable; but when once the habit is formed, what is one to do?" He had occasion to use his keys, and he felt for them in his pocket. They were missing, and he remembered that he had left them lying on the hilltop where he had had his talk with Roderick. He went forth in search of them and found them where he had thrown them. He flung himself down in the same place again. He felt indisposed to walk. He was conscious that his mood had vastly changed since the morning. His extraordinary, acute sense of his rights had been replaced by the familiar, chronic sense of his duties. Only his duties now seemed impracticable. He turned over and buried his face in his arms. He lay so long a time, thinking of many things. The sum of them all was that Roderick had beaten him. At last he was startled by an extraordinary sound. It took him a moment to perceive that it was a portentous growl of thunder. He roused himself and saw that the whole face of the sky had altered. The clouds that had hung motionless all day were moving from their stations and getting into position, as it were, for a battle. The wind was rising. The sallow vapors were turning dark and consolidating their masses. It was a striking spectacle, but Rowland judged best to observe it briefly, as a storm was evidently imminent. He took his way down to the inn, and found Singleton still at his post, profiting by the last of the rapidly failing light to finish his study, and yet at the same time taking rapid notes of the actual condition of the clouds. "We are going to have a most interesting storm," the little painter gleefully cried. "I should like awfully to do it." Rowland adjured him to pack up his tools and decamp, and repaired to the house. The air by this time had become portentously dark, and the thunder was incessant and tremendous. In the midst of it the lightning flashed and vanished, like the treble shrilling upon the bass. The innkeeper and his servants had crowded to the doorway, and were looking at the scene with faces which seemed a proof that it was unprecedented. As Rowland approached, the group divided to let some one pass from within, and Mrs. Hudson came forth, as white as a corpse, and trembling in every limb. My boy, where is my boy?" she cried. "Mr. Mallet, why are you here without him? Bring him to me." "Has no one seen Mr. Hudson?" Rowland asked of the others. "Has he not returned?" Each one shook his head and looked grave, and Rowland attempted to reassure Mrs. Hudson by saying that of course he had taken refuge in a chalet. "Go and find him, go and find him!" she cried insanely. "Don't stand there and talk, or I shall die." It was now as dark as evening, and Rowland could just distinguish the figure of Singleton scampering homeward with his box and easel. "And where is Mary?" Mrs. Hudson went on. "What in mercy's name has become of her? Mr. Mallet, why did you ever bring us here?" There came a prodigious flash of lightning, and the limitless tumult about them turned clearer than midsummer noonday. The brightness lasted long enough to enable Rowland to see a woman's figure on the top of an eminence near the house. It was Mary Garland, questioning the lurid darkness for Roderick. Rowland sprang out to interrupt her vigil, but in a moment he encountered her, retreating. He seized her hand and hurried her to the house, where, as soon as she stepped into the covered gallery, Mrs. Hudson fell upon her with frantic lamentations. "Did you see nothing, nothing?" she cried. "Tell Mr. Mallet he must go and find him, with some men, some lights, some wrappings. Go, 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 sir! In mercy, go!" Rowland was extremely perturbed by the poor lady's vociferous folly, for he deemed her anxiety superfluous. He had offered his suggestion with sincerity. Nothing was more probable than that Roderick had found shelter in a herdsman's cabin. These were numerous on the neighboring mountains, and the storm had given fair warning of its approach. Miss Garland stood there, very pale, saying nothing, but looking at him. He expected that she would check her cousin's importunity. "Can you find him?" she suddenly asked. "Would it be of use?" The question seemed to him a flash intenser than the lightning that was raking the sky before them. It shattered his dream that he weighed in the scale. But before he could answer, the full fury of the storm was upon them. The rain descended in sounding torrents. Every one fell back into the house. There had been no time to light lamps, and in the little uncarpeted parlor, in the unnatural darkness, Rowland felt Mary's hand upon his arm. For a moment it had an eloquent pressure. It seemed to retract her senseless challenge, and to say that she believed, for Roderick, what he believed. But nevertheless, thought Rowland, the cry had come, Her heart had spoken. Her first impulse had been to sacrifice him. He had been uncertain before. Here, at least, was the comfort of certainty. It must be confessed, however, that the certainty in question did little to enliven the gloom of that formidable evening. There was a noisy crowd about him in the room, noisy even with the accompaniment of the continual thunder peals, lodgers and servants chattering, shuffling, and bustling, and annoying him equally by making too light of the tempest and by vociferating their alarm. In the disorder it was some time before a lamp was lighted, and the first thing he saw, as it was swung from the ceiling, was the white face of Mrs. Hudson, who was being carried out of the room in a swoon by two stout maidservants, with Mary Garland forcing a passage. He rendered what help he could, but when they had laid the poor woman on her bed, Miss Garland motioned him away. "I think you make her worse," she said. Rowland went to his own chamber. The partitions in Swiss mountain inns are thin, and from time to time he heard Mrs. Hudson moaning 3 rooms off. Considering its great fury, the storm took long to expend itself. It was upwards of 3 hours before the thunder ceased. But even then the rain continued to fall heavily, and the night, which had come on, was impenetrably black. This lasted till near midnight. Rowland thought of Mary Garland's challenge in the porch, but he thought even more that, although the fetid interior of a high nestling chalet may offer a convenient refuge from an alpine tempest, there was no possible music in the universe so sweet as the sound of Roderick's voice. At midnight, through his dripping window pane, he saw a star, and he immediately went downstairs and out into the gallery. The rain had ceased, the cloud masses were dissevered here and there, and several stars were visible. In a few minutes he heard a step behind him, and turning, saw Miss Garland. He asked about Mrs. Hudson, and learned that she was sleeping, exhausted by her fruitless lamentations. Miss Garland kept scanning the darkness, but she said nothing to cast doubt on Roderick's having found a refuge. Rowland noticed it. "This also have I guaranteed," he said to himself. There was something that Mary wished to learn, and a question presently revealed it. "What made him start on a long walk so suddenly?" she asked. "I saw him at 11 o'clock, and he meant to go to Engelberg and sleep." "On his way to Interlaken?" Rowland said. "Yes," she answered, under cover of the darkness. "We had some talk," said Rowland, "and he seemed for the day to have given up Interlaken." "Did you dissuade him?" "Not exactly. We discussed another question which for the time superseded his plan." Miss Garland was silent. Then, "May I ask whether your discussion was violent?" she said. "I am afraid it was agreeable to neither of us." "And Roderick left you in irritation?" "I offered him my company on his walk. He declined it." Miss Garland paced slowly to the end of the gallery, and then came back. "If he had gone to Engelberg," she said, "he would have reached the hotel before the storm began." Rowland felt a sudden explosion of ferocity. "Oh, if you like," he cried, "he can start for Interlaken as soon as he comes back." But she did not even notice his wrath. "Will he come back early?" she went on. "We may suppose so." "He will know how anxious we are, and he will start with the first light." Rowland was on the point of declaring that Roderick's readiness to throw himself into the feelings of others made this extremely probable; but he checked himself and said simply, "I expect him at sunrise." Miss Garland bent her eyes once more upon the irresponsive darkness, and then in silence went into the house. Rowland, it must be averred, in spite of his resolution not to be nervous, found no sleep that night. When the early dawn began to tremble in the east, he came forth again into the open air. The storm had completely purged the atmosphere, and the day gave promise of cloudless splendor. Rowland watched the early sun shafts slowly reaching higher, and remembered that if Roderick did not come back for breakfast, there were 2 things to be taken into account. One was the heaviness of the soil on the mountain sides, saturated with the rain. This would make him walk slowly. The other was the fact that, speaking without irony, he was not remarkable for throwing himself into the sentiments of others. Breakfast at the inn was early, and by breakfast time Roderick had not appeared. Then Rowland admitted that he was nervous. Neither Mrs. Hudson nor Miss Garland had left their apartment. Rowland had a mental vision of them sitting there praying and listening. He had no desire to see them more directly. There were a couple of men who hung about the inn as guides for the ascent of the Titlis. Rowland sent each of them forth in a different direction to ask the news of Roderick at every chalet door within a morning's walk. Then he called Sam Singleton, whose peregrinations had made him an excellent mountaineer, and whose zeal and sympathy were now unbounded, and the two started together on a voyage of research. By the time they had lost sight of the inn, Rowland was obliged to confess that, decidedly, Roderick had had time to come back. He wandered about for several hours, but he found only the sunny stillness of the mountain sides. Before long he parted company with Singleton, who, to his suggestion that separation would multiply their resources, assented with a silent, frightened look, which reflected too vividly his own rapidly dawning thought. The day was magnificent, the sun was everywhere, the storm had lashed the lower slopes into a deeper flush of autumnal color, and the snow peaks reared themselves against the near horizon in glaring blocks and dazzling spires. Rowland made his way to several chalets, but most of them were empty. He thumped at their low, foul doors with a kind of nervous, savage anger. He challenged the stupid silence to tell him something about his friend. Some of these places had evidently not been open in months. The silence everywhere was horrible. It seemed to mock at his impatience and to be a conscious symbol of calamity. In the midst of it, at the door of one of the chalets, quite alone, sat a hideous cretin, who grinned at Rowland over his goitre when, hardly knowing what he did, he questioned him. The creature's family was scattered on the mountain sides. He could give Rowland no help to find them. Rowland climbed into many awkward places, and skirted, intently and peeringly, many an ugly chasm and steep dropping ledge. But the sun, as I have said, was everywhere. It illumined the deep places over which, not knowing where to turn next, he halted and lingered, and showed him nothing but the stony alpine void, nothing so human even as death. At noon he paused in his quest and sat down on a stone. The conviction was pressing upon him that the worst that was now possible was true. He suspended his search. He was afraid to go on. He sat there for an hour, sick to the depths of his soul. Without his knowing why, several things chiefly trivial that had happened during the last 2 years, and that he had quite forgotten, became vividly present to his mind. He was aroused at last by the sound of a stone dislodged near by, which rattled down the mountain. In a moment, on a steep rocky slope opposite to him, he beheld a figure cautiously descending, a figure which was not Roderick. It was Singleton, who had seen him and began to beckon to him. Come down, cried the painter, steadily making his own way down. Rowland saw that as he moved, and even as he selected his foothold and watched his steps, he was looking at something at the bottom of the cliff. This was a great rugged wall, which had fallen backward from the perpendicular, and the descent, though difficult, was with care sufficiently practicable. "What do you see?" cried Rowland. Singleton stopped, looked across at him, and seemed to hesitate. Then, come down," he simply repeated. Rowland's course was also a steep descent, and he attacked it so precipitately that he afterwards marveled he had not broken his neck. It was a 10 minutes' headlong scramble. Halfway down he saw something that made him dizzy. He saw what Singleton had seen. In the gorge below them a vague white mass lay tumbled upon the stones. He let himself go, blindly, fiercely. Singleton had reached the rocky bottom of the ravine before him, and had bounded forward and fallen upon his knees. Rowland overtook him, and his own legs collapsed. The thing that yesterday was his friend lay before him as the chance of the last breath had left it, and out of it Roderick's face stared upward, open-eyed, at the sky. He had fallen from a great height, but he was singularly little disfigured. The rain had spent its torrents upon him, and his clothes and hair were as wet as if the billows of the ocean had flung him upon the strand. An attempt to move him would show some hideous fracture, some horrible physical dishonour. But what Rowland saw on first looking at him was only a strangely serene expression of life. The eyes were dead, but in a short time, when Rowland had closed them, the whole face seemed to awake. The rain had washed away all blood. It was as if violence, having done her work, had stolen away in shame. Roderick's face might have shamed her. It looked admirably handsome. "He was a beautiful man," said Singleton. They looked up through their horror at the cliff from which he had apparently fallen, and which lifted its blank and stony face above him, with no care now but to drink the sunshine on which his eyes were closed. And then Rowland had an immense outbreak of pity and anguish. At last they spoke of carrying him back to the inn. "There must be 3 or 4 men," Rowland said, "and they must be brought here quickly. I have not the least idea where we are." "We are about 3 hours' walk from home," said Singleton. "I will go for help. I can find my way." "Remember," said Rowland, "whom you will have to face." "I remember," the excellent fellow answered. "There is nothing I could ever do for him in life. I will do what I can now." He went off, and Rowland stayed there alone. He watched for 7 long hours, and his vigil was forever memorable. The most rational of men was, for an hour, the most passionate. He reviled himself with transcendent bitterness. He accused himself of cruelty and injustice. He would have lain down there in Roderick's place to unsay the words that had yesterday driven him forth on his lonely ramble. Roderick had been fond of saying that there are such things as necessary follies, and Rowland was now proving it. At last he grew almost used to the dumb exultation of the cliff above him. He saw that Roderick was a mass of hideous injury, and he tried to understand what had happened. Not that it helped him. Before that confounding mortality, one hypothesis after another faltered and swooned away. Roderick's passionate walk had carried him farther and higher than he knew. He had outstayed, supposedly, the first menace of the storm, and perhaps even found a defiant entertainment in watching it. Perhaps he had simply lost himself. The tempest had overtaken him, and when he tried to return, it was too late. He had attempted to descend the cliff in the darkness, he had made the inevitable slip, and whether he had fallen 50 feet or 300 little mattered. The condition of his body indicated the shorter fall. Now that all was over, Rowland understood how exclusively, for 2 years, Roderick had filled his life. His occupation was gone. Singleton came back with 4 men, one of them the landlord of the inn. They had formed a sort of rude bier of the frame of a chaise à porteurs, and by taking a very roundabout course homeward, were able to follow a tolerably level path and carry their burden with a certain decency. To Rowland it seemed as if the little procession would never reach the inn, but as they drew near it he would have given his right hand for a longer delay. The people of the inn came forward to meet them, in a little silent, solemn convoy. In the doorway, clinging together, appeared the 2 bereaved women. Mrs. Hudson tottered forward with outstretched hands and the expression of a blind person, but before she reached her son, Mary Garland had rushed past her, and in the face of the staring, pitying, awe-stricken crowd, had flung herself, with the magnificent movement of one whose rights were supreme, and with a loud tremendous cry, upon the senseless vestige of her love. That cry still lives in Rowland's ears. It interposes persistently against the reflection that when he sometimes, very rarely, sees her, she is unreservedly kind to him; against the memory that during the dreary journey back to America, made of course with his assistance, there was a great frankness in her gratitude, a great gratitude in her frankness. Miss Garland lives with Mrs. Hudson at Northampton, where Rowland visits his cousin Cecilia more frequently than of old. When he calls upon Miss Garland, he never sees Mrs. Hudson. Cecilia, who, having her shrewd impression that he comes to see Miss Garland as much as to see herself, does not feel obliged to seem unduly flattered, calls him, whenever he reappears, the most restless of mortals. But he always says to her in answer, No, I assure you I am the most patient. End of Chapter 13. End of Roderick Hudson, by Henry James. Read by Nicholas Clifford.